The dark truth about medieval castle life. To all those intrepid historians who've braved dusty archives and questionable smells in pursuit of truth and maybe a decent pub lunch, this one's for you. Specifically, this is dedicated to the unsung heroes, the medieval chamber pot emptiers, whose contributions to history have been far too long overlooked. Their dedication to their craft, their silent suffering amidst the aroma of 1,000 unwashed bodies, deserves recognition and possibly a lifetime supply of air freshener. They were the true knights of sanitation, silently battling the stench of ages, unsung and unappreciated, yet their labors made life slightly less pestilential for the rest of us. This book, in its gloriously irreverent way, aims to shed light on their and everyone else's forgotten struggles. Let us never forget those who endured the truly unglamorous aspects of castle life, the icy drafts that found their way into every crevice, the relentless dripping of leaky roofs. Why is that always a thing in old buildings? The unnerving creaks and groans of the structure at night, all while sharing the cramped quarters with people whose personal hygiene was, shall we say, flexible. While kings and queens are often portrayed as glamorous figures, imagine their daily reality, lice infestations, on a scale that would make a modern-day exterminator weep, chamber pots overflowing with, well, you get the picture, and food that was a gamble between delicious and deadly. This is not the stuff of romantic fairy tales. This book aims to acknowledge the very real challenges faced by all inhabitants of the medieval castle, from the lord to the lowliest scullery maid, and to do so with the irreverence and respect they deserve. It also goes out to my long-suffering cat, Mittens, who tolerated my endless muttering and frantic scribbling while this book was being written. You're a good cat, Mittens. You deserve a lifetime supply of tuna, and maybe a small, medieval-style castle made of cardboard, because even cats deserve a bit of historical context in their lives. Chapter 1. The Stone Age, sort of. Forget Disney. Forget sweeping shots of sun-drenched battlements and gallant knights. Let's talk about the real medieval castle. Picture this: damp, drafty stone walls that whisper tales of chill winds whistling through poorly sealed cracks. Imagine the aroma, a pungent cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and the ever-present lingering fragrance of chamber pots. This wasn't some pristine fairy tale kingdom. This was a medieval castle, and it smelled like a week-old gym sock that's been left in a swamp. Our story begins with the Miller family. Not the whimsical Miller of children's stories, but Thomas Miller, his wife Agnes, and their 3 perpetually grubby children. They resided in a small, stone-walled room within the castle walls, a space generously described as adequate. Adequate, in this case, meant perpetually damp, thanks to a persistent leak somewhere near the chimney. Agnes spent a significant portion of her day battling the mold that thrived in the damp corners, a constant losing battle against the relentless onslaught of moisture. Their bed, a straw mattress spread on a wooden frame, offered little respite from the damp earth beneath. Their children, perpetually sniffling and coughing, were a testament to the castle's inadequate ventilation. Thomas, bless his soul, was convinced that the dampness added character to their dwelling, a sentiment Agnes did not share. She'd often mutter about the character giving her a nasty case of rheumatism. Nearby lived the castle cook, a perpetually grumpy fellow named Bartholomew. Bartholomew's culinary creations were legendary, not for their taste, but for their ability to inspire a variety of stomach ailments. The castle's pantry, a far cry from the modern supermarket, was a chaotic jumble of questionable meats hanging in questionable conditions, vegetables that had seen better days, weeks, even months ago, and barrels of fermented beverages of dubious origin. Refrigeration, as we understand it, was non existent. Meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or the hopeful process of leaving it out in the cold, a gamble in the unpredictable medieval climate. The lack of fresh ingredients was a source of constant frustration for Bartholomew, who frequently lamented the lack of decent herbs and the prevalence of weevils in his flour. He once claimed that a rat had tasted his stew before he did, a declaration that didn't exactly boost morale amongst the castle staff. The lack of sanitation was, to put it mildly, appalling. Indoor plumbing as a concept hadn't even begun to sprout its medieval roots. Chamber pots were the preferred method of waste disposal, emptied, if one were lucky, into a designated hole somewhere in the castle walls. The result was a pervasive odor that permeated every corner, a constant olfactory reminder of the castle's less glamorous aspects. Washing facilities were rudimentary at best. A bucket of cold water and a rough cloth were the standard toiletries for even the wealthiest inhabitants. Bathing was a rare event, reserved mostly for major holidays and special occasions, and even then, it was likely more of a symbolic ritual than a thorough cleansing. Lice infestations were commonplace, considered almost a badge of honor among some. The persistent scratching sounds from within the castle walls were more commonplace than the sound of singing birds. Pests were another unwelcome guest in this medieval drama. Rats, mice, and various insects thrived in the castle's dark crevices and damp corners. Fleas were an omnipresent menace, making their presence known through relentless itching and the occasional alarming sight of their small, dark bodies hopping across floors and furniture. Controlling these pests was a constant challenge. Cats, rather than being pampered pets, were working members of the castle staff, tasked with the unenviable job of keeping the rodent population in check. Their efforts were often in vain. Imagine the sounds, the incessant drip, drip, drip of that persistent leak in the miller's room, competing with the snoring of a dozen knights in the dormitory down the hall, the squeaking of rats navigating the labyrinthine corridors, the occasional panicked squeal of a pig escaping its pen, and the surprisingly loud thump of barrels being rolled across the stone floors. Sleep was a luxury, a sporadic respite from the cacophony of sounds that permeated the castle walls. Even the silence was punctuated with the constant sounds of nature, the wind, the rain, the distant howls of wolves or dogs. Silence meant the world was still. This was a symphony of sounds and smells that would make even the most seasoned camper reconsider their camping trip. The castle's interior was a complex maze of corridors, chambers, and staircases, a labyrinthine structure that was as challenging to navigate as it was to maintain. The stone walls were thick, cold, and unforgiving, offering little insulation from the elements. In winter, The castle was perpetually freezing, with drafts that seemed to cut through even the warmest furs and woolens. In summer, it was a stifling oven, with the heat trapped within the thick stone walls. The castle's layout, designed for defense rather than comfort, often resulted in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms, making the lives of its inhabitants exceedingly unpleasant. There was little privacy. The sound of snoring, coughing, and general movement easily carried through thin walls. Even the royal quarters weren't immune to the persistent drafts and noises of a medieval castle. Let's not forget the castle's inhabitants themselves. The idealized image of knights clad in gleaming armor is far removed from the reality. That armor, while impressive to look at, was incredibly heavy, cumbersome, and utterly impractical. Wearing it was like being encased in a medieval spacesuit, a suit of metal that restricted movement, caused overheating, and often led to injury. A knight in full armor couldn't easily mount a horse, couldn't run for any significant distance, couldn't use his hands or even drink without a helping hand. He was, essentially, a heavily armored and fairly immobile human being. And forget about using the toilet. The castle's defense mechanisms were more than just walls and moats. The castle's very structure was designed to protect its inhabitants from invaders, yes, but also from the elements and from each other. The cramped quarters, the lack of privacy, the shared spaces, all contributed to a sense of claustrophobia and confinement. Living in a medieval castle wasn't a romantic adventure. It was a test of endurance, a struggle for survival. It was a constant battle against cold, dampness, disease, and a persistent and quite overwhelming smell. The reality was far, far removed from the image of romanticized medieval castles often portrayed in movies and books. It was, in a word, unpleasant. And we haven't even begun to talk about the food or the medicine. But that, my friends, is for another chapter. Let's delve into the glamorous world of medieval warfare, shall we? Forget the shining, perfectly fitting armor of Hollywood epics. The reality was considerably less appealing. Imagine strapping yourself into a suit of metal so heavy it would make a sumo wrestler wince. That's the closest modern equivalent to wearing a suit of plate armor. We're talking hundreds of pounds of steel, riveted and bolted together in a magnificent display of medieval engineering and medieval discomfort. Think of it as a 14th century spacesuit, but instead of exploring the moon, you're charging into a chaotic melee where blunt force trauma and the risk of a nasty case of tetanus are everyday concerns. The weight alone was enough to sap your strength, making even the simplest tasks Herculean efforts. Mounting a horse, for instance, was less a graceful maneuver and more a carefully orchestrated, gravity-defying struggle. A knight wouldn't simply swing himself onto the saddle. He'd often require assistance, potentially needing a sturdy ladder or a helpful stable hand to haul his armored self into position. Dismounting was an equally precarious affair, often resulting in a rather undignified thud to the ground. Once mounted, the knight was essentially a heavily armored statue on horseback. His range of movement was severely restricted. Want to scratch your nose? Good luck with that. Simple actions, like reaching for your sword or adjusting your helmet, required a complex series of contortions, a ballet of limited movement that demanded years of practice. The armor wasn't designed for agility. It was designed to withstand blows. Agility was a luxury a knight could ill afford once he'd donned his metal shell. And then there was the heat. Imagine spending hours, even days, encased in a metal oven during the summer months. The sun beating down on polished steel, trapped heat radiating inward. It's a recipe for a medieval heat stroke, a very real danger for knights in full armor. Dehydration was a constant threat, exacerbated by the difficulty of drinking while encased in metal. A knight needed help even to raise a drinking horn, let alone sip from it. Water skins were impractical, and carrying extra water in the heat was an added weight issue. So, knights often had to rely on their squires to provide them with hydration and sustenance while in full battle gear. The heat within the armor was bad enough. One can imagine the discomfort of moving in hot sun for hours on end. Even minor accidents could become major catastrophes. A simple stumble could result in a dislocated shoulder, or worse, a broken bone. Removing the armor was a slow, often painful process, requiring the assistance of several people and a degree of patience that few possessed in the heat of battle or when a knight needed to simply use the privy. This process would have been incredibly difficult for any injured knight, making treatment a serious ordeal. Think of getting your limbs out of that metal suit while being in severe pain and having a possible fracture. It would have been like getting out of a very heavy, ill-fitted spacesuit after a fall on the moon. Not ideal, and incredibly dangerous. The armor itself wasn't always as pristine as depicted in paintings. It was prone to dents, scratches, and rust. The upkeep was considerable, demanding regular cleaning, polishing, and repair, jobs handled by the knight's squires and armorers. A knight's armor was expensive. The craftsmanship involved was extraordinary. Making a suit of armor was a lengthy process, requiring a high level of skill and dedication. Consequently, it was exceptionally costly, further illustrating that it was a status symbol. Maintaining a pristine appearance was another concern. The armor would have been subjected to the rigors of battle, resulting in stains, scratches, and other damage. Cleaning would have been difficult, requiring special tools and considerable effort. Despite the effort and expense, the armor could quickly become damaged in battle. A dented helmet, a broken visor, or a damaged breastplate could leave a knight vulnerable to injury. It was a continuous cycle of wear, tear, and repair. Let's not forget the psychological impact of wearing such an imposing suit of metal. It must have been claustrophobic, isolating, and profoundly heavy. The constant weight, the restricted movement, the heat, all of these factors would have contributed to a considerable amount of fatigue and physical strain. Even the strongest knight must have felt the burden of this medieval spacesuit, particularly during long campaigns. It was a physical and mental endurance test. And let's not gloss over the inconvenient realities, the lack of readily accessible lavatories. Let's just say that nature's call was a logistical nightmare for a knight in full armor. Eliminating bodily waste was a complicated affair, requiring a considerable amount of time, effort, and assistance. It was far from convenient, a situation made far worse if the battle was ongoing and the knight didn't want to remove his armor. So the next time you see a depiction of a medieval knight in shining armor, remember the reality. It was a cumbersome, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous suit of metal that required considerable strength, skill, and assistance simply to wear. It wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a symbol of endurance, practicality's awkward cousin. It was a medieval spacesuit, and its wearers were the brave astronauts of a very different, very unglamorous era. They faced not alien landscapes, but the harsh realities of medieval warfare, a constant struggle against the elements, the enemy, and the sheer weight of their own equipment. Now, let's move from the battlefield's brutal realities to the equally brutal realities of the medieval castle kitchen, a place where culinary artistry met with a distinct lack of hygiene and refrigeration. Forget the romantic notions of lavish feasts. The reality was far less appealing, a culinary catastrophe waiting to happen. Imagine a world without refrigerators, freezers, or even reliable methods of preserving food. Fresh food was a luxury, and preservation techniques were, let's just say, rudimentary. The average medieval diet was a far cry from the colorful spreads we enjoy today. Meat, predominantly pork, beef, mutton, and poultry, formed the backbone of most meals, though not always in a particularly palatable state. Game, venison, boar, rabbit, occasionally supplemented the menu, assuming a successful hunt. But meat preservation was a major challenge. Salting, smoking, and spicing were the primary methods, often resulting in dishes that were more pungent than palatable. Imagine a piece of meat, salted and smoked to within an inch of its life, then left to sit in the summer sun for a few days. Not exactly a Michelin star experience. Vegetables were a less frequent component of the diet, often limited to what could be grown locally and stored successfully through the winter. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips offered some sustenance, alongside cabbages, onions, and leeks, staples that added flavor and nutrients, even if their appeal was somewhat less pronounced than modern produce. The selection was severely limited by seasonality and storage capabilities, resulting in a very one-dimensional diet for much of the year. Fruits, while present, were also subjected to the same limitations. Apples, pears, and berries provided some variety, though their availability was seasonal. Preserving fruit was a challenge, and many techniques resulted in something closer to a fermented concoction than a delightful dessert. Imagine trying to recreate a modern fruit salad with produce that's been left to sit out for days. The lack of refrigeration was a constant battle against spoilage. Food quickly went bad, especially in the warmer months. The castle kitchen was a surprisingly busy place, dealing with the constant cycle of preparation, cooking, and discarding food. There's always the question of what they did with the discarded and spoiled food. It's possible it simply went to waste, which would have been a substantial issue. But some historians suggest it might have been fed to animals, or in some instances, perhaps even repurposed in less appealing ways. The concept of food safety as we understand it today was entirely foreign to the medieval mind. Hygiene standards were, to put it mildly, lax. Hands were rarely washed, utensils were reused without cleaning, and the proximity of animals to food preparation areas was alarmingly casual. Rats and other vermin were common sights within castle kitchens, a constant risk of spreading diseases and contaminating food. The resulting foodborne illnesses were unfortunately quite commonplace. Diarrhea, dysentery, and typhoid were everyday occurrences. Imagine a typical medieval banquet. The sheer scale of a royal feast was impressive, a testament to the power and wealth of the reigning monarch. Long tables laden with roasted meats, stews, pies, and countless bowls of various substances, some identifiable, others less so, were arranged for the occasion. However, amidst the apparent opulence, danger lurked. The air itself hung thick with the aroma of overcooked meat, aged cheese, and something that was best left unidentified. Let's delve into the specifics of this medieval culinary adventure. The main course might consist of a roasted boar, its flesh possibly slightly off in taste. Its size alone would be impressive, but perhaps not so appetizing given the preparation methods. Next, a pottage, a thick stew, would grace the table, its ingredients a mystery. Maybe a mixture of barley, beans, and various vegetables, or perhaps some mystery meat thrown in for good measure. The stew itself had spent the day simmering over an open fire in a rather murky pot. The pies were even more of an enigma. The pastry, often tough and dense, likely concealed a filling of meat and vegetables that could range from palatable to, well, let's say potentially questionable. The pies were notorious for containing whatever ingredients happened to be available, a chaotic mixture that one might not want to examine too closely before consuming. And then there were the desserts. Fruit tarts, if the season allowed, might be served, though the fruit itself would have likely seen better days. Honey cakes, sweetened with honey that possibly had a few unexpected guests residing within, also made an appearance. The overall effect of a medieval banquet was a sensory assault. The smells were a combination of cooked meat, aged cheese, and possibly some fermenting fruit, all vying for attention with the ambient smells of the castle itself. The tastes could be equally unpredictable, a mixture of bland, pungent, and occasionally surprisingly palatable, depending on the chef's skills and the food's age. The dangers extended beyond questionable taste. The risk of food poisoning was ever present, a constant threat hovering over the entire affair. Medieval medicine was rudimentary at best. If food poisoning struck, the outcome could be dire. In some cases, it resulted in debilitating illness, and in others, death. But the most significant problem was the lack of personal hygiene. Hands were rarely washed, and utensils were shared, leading to the rapid spread of diseases. Foodborne illness was not just a possibility. It was an accepted, although unwelcome, element of every meal. Imagine the spread of germs from serving utensils, shared across all the guests without proper cleaning. Each guest might have transferred germs to another, leading to a domino effect of illness and discomfort. This lack of hygiene also extended to the food preparation itself. The kitchen would have been a messy, chaotic space with minimal sanitation. Rodents were a constant issue. Open sewage would frequently contaminate water sources. Even the most meticulously prepared meal could be contaminated. The result was a daily gamble with health, where each bite posed a risk. It was a culinary game of chance, where survival was a triumph over the odds. The story of medieval castle cuisine is a testament to human resilience and the surprising ability of the human stomach to endure. While the romantic image of lavish feasts persists, the reality was far less glamorous, a constant struggle against spoilage, unsanitary conditions, and the ever-present threat of foodborne illness. The medieval cook was less a chef and more a resourceful survivor, battling the elements and the limitations of the era. It was a culinary dark age, a period where survival was as much a factor as culinary skill. Next time you complain about a slightly undercooked chicken, remember the medieval cooks whose culinary struggles were far more significant than yours. Now, having survived, mostly, the culinary perils of the medieval castle, let's turn our attention to something even more perilous: medieval medicine. Forget the kindly bearded physician dispensing gentle remedies. The reality was far more pungent. Imagine a world where the leading medical theories were based on the balance of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a concept that would make even the most seasoned homeopath shudder. Disease, in this worldview, wasn't caused by microscopic invaders, but by an imbalance of these bodily fluids. The treatment, therefore, often involved restoring this balance through methods that would leave modern doctors slack-jawed in horror. Bloodletting, for example, was the go-to treatment for almost any ailment, from a simple headache to the bubonic plague. The reasoning: if you had too much blood or too much of any humor, the solution was simple: remove it. Leeches, lancets, and various other instruments were employed to drain precious bodily fluids, often with disastrous results. The patient might have felt a momentary sense of relief, mistaking the faint from blood loss for a miraculous cure. However, this cure often weakened the already compromised immune system, leaving the patient more vulnerable to infection and death. It's like treating a computer virus by deleting the operating system. Another popular medieval remedy was purging. Think of it as a medieval colon cleanse, except instead of a gentle detox tea, it involved potent laxatives, often concocted from plants that would make even a seasoned gardener hesitate. These potent purges were used to cleanse the body of the supposed bad humors, frequently causing severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and even death. The medieval version of a gut reset, it left you feeling less cleansed and more like you'd wrestled a rabid badger. Then there were the cures, based on animal parts and strange concoctions: unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, often sold for exorbitant prices, ground up beetles, powdered mummy remains, and various other disgusting ingredients were all used in medieval remedies. The efficacy of these remedies was, shall we say, debatable. In fact, many were probably actively harmful. The logic behind these remedies was often rooted in magical thinking, or perhaps a profound lack of understanding about the body's processes, a bit like trying to fix a car by rubbing magic crystals on it. And let's not forget the pervasive belief in the power of prayer and the divine intervention. While faith can undoubtedly provide comfort, it's not a very effective treatment for pneumonia. The medieval worldview saw illness as a punishment for sin or the work of evil spirits, so prayer and exorcisms were often as prominent as, and sometimes more effective than, more tangible medical interventions. The clergy often played a significant role in healthcare, and their methods, while often well-intentioned, were not always scientifically sound. The lack of understanding of basic hygiene and sanitation exacerbated the problem. Disease spread like wildfire through medieval castles due to unsanitary living conditions and a complete lack of awareness of germs. Think crowded quarters, overflowing chamber pots, and a general disregard for hand washing. It's a wonder they survived at all. The death rate, particularly among infants and children, was staggeringly high. Infectious diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and the plague were frequent and devastating visitors. A child reaching adulthood was a testament to their resilience rather than a sign of good health care. Imagine losing multiple children to illnesses we now easily treat with antibiotics. Let's consider a fictional family within a medieval castle to illustrate the point. The Dayberg family consists of Lord and Lady de Burgh and their 4 children, Thomas 8, Eleanor 6, Giles 4, and baby Agnes 1. The arrival of the bubonic plague sweeps through their castle like a particularly vicious wind. Thomas, showing initial symptoms, fever, swollen lymph nodes, and the telltale dark blotches, is quickly isolated, though not before he's infected his younger siblings. The family attempts to treat the symptoms based on the medical knowledge of the time. Bloodletting for Thomas doesn't work. The physician, a portly man with a dubious reputation, applies leeches to reduce his blood volume, adding to the suffering. Eleanor develops a severe cough, probably pneumonia, and receives a mixture of herbs, the recipe known only to the village wise woman, and not even she knows their specific medicinal properties. Giles experiences debilitating diarrhea, treated with a frankly aggressive dose of laxatives. Poor baby Agnes is too young to receive any specific treatment at all. Her fate is mostly decided by the plague's virulence and her own meager resilience. The scene is one of chaos and despair. The castle is filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, and feverish delirium. The smells are equally unpleasant. The stench of sickness, decaying flesh, and the acrid aroma of the dubious remedies employed. As the days turn into nights, the family witnesses the slow, agonizing demise of their children. Agnes, their little baby, succumbs to the plague before anyone knows what hit her. Giles endures days of agonizing pain before his small body succumbs to dehydration and exhaustion. Thomas and Eleanor are treated with heroic measures, but their immune systems are simply overwhelmed. The family is shattered. This is not a unique scenario. Similar tragedies played out time and time again in castles across the medieval world. The contrast with modern medicine is stark. Today, antibiotics can effectively combat bacterial infections. Vaccines protect against many diseases. Sanitation and hygiene practices significantly reduce the spread of infectious disease, and advanced medical technologies provide hope and cures. The medieval family's fate, a near certain death for all children, would be unthinkable today, barring the most exceptional and extraordinary circumstances. Their story underscores the staggering advances made in medicine and public health. Next time you take a seemingly trivial medication or get a vaccine, remember the de Burgh family and appreciate the immense progress humanity has made in conquering disease and death. It's a remarkable victory over suffering, one that often goes unappreciated in our modern health-obsessed society. We may still complain about a bad cold, but a swift recovery is a testament to the medical miracles of our times. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange before finally surrendering to the encroaching darkness. Within the thick stone walls of the castle, a different kind of twilight descended. It wasn't a gentle fading of light, but a plunge into a world of sounds and smells that would curdle the milk of even the most hardened dairymaid. Forget the romantic moonlit serenades. The soundtrack to a medieval castle night was far less idyllic. First, there was the symphony of snoring. Dozens of bodies, crammed into ill-ventilated rooms, emitted a chorus of grunts, snores, and the occasional strangled gasp. Each snore was a unique instrument in this cacophony. Some were low and rumbling, others high-pitched and reedy, while a select few resembled the death rattle of a particularly stubborn goose. Adding to the sonic tapestry were the sighs and rustles of bed sheets, a constant reminder of the shared proximity of all these slumbering souls. Then there were the animals. Medieval castles weren't exactly renowned for their commitment to animal welfare, or even basic hygiene for that matter. Chickens scratched and pecked in the dusty corners of the courtyard, their incessant clucking a persistent counterpoint to the human snoring. Pigs, regarded more as living larders than as pets, rooted around in the muck, their snorts and squeals adding a decidedly porcine flavor to the nighttime orchestra. Dogs, a diverse and often mangy collection, barked, whimpered, and occasionally engaged in territorial disputes that culminated in the kind of canine chorus only a medieval kennel could produce. Cats, sleek and independent, added their own subtle meows, contributing to the overall cacophony, a soundtrack of the feudal era that would leave even the most seasoned city dweller yearning for the quiet of a modern apartment. Adding to this farmyard cacophony, the castle was a living, breathing entity. The wind whistled through cracks in the stonework, creating mournful howls that echoed through the corridors. The timbers of the castle creaked and groaned under the weight of the centuries, their age-old complaints adding to the unsettling soundscape. Water dripped relentlessly from leaky roofs and unseen pipes, a constant rhythmic drip, drip, drip that would eventually wear down the patience of the most resolute monk. Even the stone itself seemed to breathe, emitting low groans and sighs, creating the eerie soundscape of this medieval setting. The overall effect was less of a peaceful slumber and more of a full-scale acoustic assault. Then there was the lack of privacy. Castle walls, while imposing on the outside, offered little in the way of soundproofing. Every cough, every sneeze, every whispered secret was amplified and transmitted through the stone, creating an intimate, in the worst possible sense, shared experience of sleep deprivation. The thin wooden partitions separating sleeping quarters meant that the snoring, the animal sounds, the creaks and groans were not merely sounds, they were vibrations that permeated every fiber of the castle's inhabitants, blurring the boundaries between individual experience and communal discomfort. The castle lacked any concept of sanitation that we'd recognize today. The pungent aroma of unwashed bodies, combined with the lingering scent of chamber pots and the ever-present animal smells, created an olfactory experience that was, to put it mildly, unforgettable. This was not the sterile, antiseptic clean of a modern hospital. This was a sensory overload that left a little room for romanticizing. One particular night, A feast celebrating a particularly meaningless victory in a local squabble had been followed by an excessive consumption of ale. The ensuing festivities had reached a level of inebriated chaos that exceeded even the castle's usual level of rowdiness. The sounds that emanated from the great hall were far from the delicate strains of a lute. Rather, they resembled a drunken brawl conducted by a chorus of boisterous warriors. Shouts, laughter, the clattering of tankards, and the occasional drunken belch. It was a symphony of debauchery that echoed through the castle walls, disturbing the uneasy slumber of everyone within. The night's revelry took an unexpected turn when a drunken knight, clad in his ill-fitting armor, tripped over a stray piglet and launched himself through a nearby tapestry, creating a cacophony that overshadowed even the ale-fueled boisterousness. The sounds of splintering wood, followed by an extended series of curses, punctuated by the startled squeals of the pig, turned the night into a farcical show. The soundscape of the castle that night transformed from a simple chaotic cacophony to a full-fledged performance, with every sound amplified and played out against the backdrop of the castle's aging structure. This performance was not a carefully orchestrated symphony, but rather a raw, visceral depiction of life in medieval times, far removed from the idealized portrayals often seen. This incident underscored the complete lack of privacy and quiet, highlighting the stark contrast between the romanticized image of medieval castles and the uncomfortable reality experienced by its inhabitants. But the night didn't end there. The drunken brawl spilled out into the castle courtyard, where the already chaotic soundscape escalated further. The clash of steel as drunken knights stumbled over each other, a sequence punctuated by the shrieks of alarmed chickens and the frustrated grunts of the piglet, created a bizarre and unsettling ballet of violence and drunken incompetence. The sounds of the drunken revelry mixed with the sounds of the night itself, the dripping water, the groaning timbers, the wind whistling through cracks in the walls, a testament to the chaotic and often unpredictable nature of medieval life. The chaos eventually subsided, though not without leaving a trail of broken furniture, bruised egos, and several thoroughly disgruntled chickens. The sounds, however, lingered, a haunting echo of the night's events against the backdrop of the usual castle noises. The night's events weren't unique. Such incidents were commonplace in medieval castles, and the sounds that followed were a constant reminder of the chaotic and often dangerous world these individuals inhabited. It was a world where even sleep was a battle fought against the relentless onslaught of sounds and smells, a relentless struggle against the constant discomfort of life within those imposing stone walls. The quiet moments were the exceptions, not the rule, highlighting the sensory assault that was everyday life in a medieval castle. In fact, if you ever managed a full night's unbroken sleep in a medieval castle, you were likely already dead and blissfully unaware of the noisy horrors continuing around you. Chapter 2: Kings, Queens, and their king issues. Let's be honest, the idea of a medieval king or queen is often associated with opulent robes, sparkling jewels, and an air of regal cleanliness. The reality, however, was considerably less glamorous. While peasants might have wrestled with the daily grime of agricultural labor, royalty faced a different set of hygiene challenges, challenges amplified by their own peculiar social conventions and a baffling lack of modern plumbing. Forget the perfumed baths depicted in Renaissance paintings. Cleanliness, for medieval monarchs, was a relative concept. Clean water, a resource often scarce even in castles, was a precious commodity, certainly not to be squandered on frequent bathing. Think of it like this. Your average medieval king probably showered about as often as you deep clean your oven, maybe once a year if you were lucky, and far less if your kingdom was embroiled in a particularly nasty war. The concept of personal hygiene that we take for granted today was simply absent. We're talking about an era where the fashionable perfume of the day was frequently designed to mask, and I'm using the term mask loosely, the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies. Let's face it, the scent of royalty wasn't exactly Chanel No. 5. It was more akin to a potent cocktail of body odor, stale sweat, and perhaps a hint of that day's boar roast, if they were feeling particularly lavish. Consider the matter of lice. Those tiny six-legged hitchhikers were practically a royal accessory. They were so commonplace that their presence was more a matter of social acceptance than a cause for concern. Think of them as the fleas of the aristocracy. While modern royalty might fret over their hairstylists, their medieval counterparts were probably more concerned with keeping the lice population under control, a task that was, shall we say, far less sophisticated than modern head lice treatments. Herbal concoctions, if used at all, were often more likely to mask the smell than eliminate the critters. Imagine the royal court, a glittering gathering of nobles and courtiers. A closer inspection, however, would reveal a rather unsettling sight. A tapestry of tiny, crawling creatures silently sharing the opulent surroundings. The very fabric of royal life, it seems, was woven with these unwanted guests. It's almost comical to imagine a king delivering a royal decree, completely oblivious to the legions of lice marching across his silken robe. And what about the royal bath? Picture this: a large wooden tub, not exactly a jacuzzi, filled with lukewarm water, perhaps scented with herbs to help battle the stench. The privacy? Forget about it. This was a social event, a royal gathering of a rather intimate nature. The king, perhaps, might enjoy this occasion with his courtiers, family, and several servants assisting in the ritual. This wasn't a relaxing spa day. It was more of a communal soak, a surprisingly sociable occasion where the royal family would bathe all together, possibly even with some of the most trusted servants. Let's just say that maintaining a degree of privacy would have been a significant challenge. The water once used was likely used again, perhaps diluted with some fresh water to stretch the supply. Efficiency was key, especially if clean water sources were scarce. Think of it as the most exclusive, yet absolutely least hygienic, spa treatment ever devised. The experience was likely more about ritual than actual cleanliness, a far cry from our modern standards. The lack of proper sanitation affected even the most basic aspects of royal life. Chamber pots were the norm, and their contents were emptied less frequently than one might hope. The resulting odors were a constant, inescapable companion, creating an atmosphere that was anything but princely. One can only imagine the pungent air within the castle walls, a constant reminder of the era's limitations concerning sanitation and hygiene. Royal clothing offered little in the way of hygiene protection. Undergarments were often sparse, and outer garments were not washed as frequently as they are today. Many garments were simply worn until they were beyond repair, regardless of their level of cleanliness. The concept of a change of clothes held a meaning very different from our own understanding of the concept. Imagine attending a royal banquet, surrounded by resplendent attire and the clinking of goblets. But let's not get carried away with the romantic vision. Behind that glittering facade lurked a cloud of less than desirable odors. The aromas of stale food, unwashed bodies, and who knows what else. The air at a royal banquet would not have been the airy, refreshing ambiance of a modern-day five-star restaurant. The stories and accounts of royal illnesses highlight the health challenges of the era. Diseases were rampant, and the lack of sanitation played a significant role. The absence of clean water and proper hygiene practices created a breeding ground for infections and epidemics. The very notion of germ theory was centuries away, making disease prevention a rather uncertain pursuit. So, the next time you see a romanticized depiction of a medieval king or queen, remember the reality. It wasn't all glittering jewels and luxurious silks. It was a world where even the most powerful individuals struggled with the basics of sanitation, resulting in a lifestyle significantly less glamorous than popularly imagined. It was a world where hygiene was far less a priority than maintaining appearances, where the scent of royalty wasn't perfume, but a potent, perhaps even unsettling blend of body odors and the ever-present reminder of the realities of medieval life. A reality where the very definition of clean was drastically different from our own. The contrast between the romanticized image of medieval royalty and their actual living conditions serves as a powerful reminder of the limitations and realities of the era. It highlights the importance of historical accuracy in our understanding of the past, moving beyond on the superficial glamour to uncover the often unpleasant truths of daily life. The lack of sanitation and hygiene wasn't a matter of neglect. It was a consequence of the limitations of technology, understanding, and available resources. It's a reminder that history, when viewed honestly, can be both fascinating and a touch revolting. And let's be honest, a little bit of revolting makes for a much more engaging story. The glittering facade of court life often masked a grim reality. Disease was a constant, unwelcome guest at royal gatherings. Forget the charming depiction of courtly dances and elegant feasts. The air hung thick not just with the scent of expensive perfumes attempting to overcome the pervasive body odor, but with the ever-present threat of contagion. The very architecture of castles, designed for defense against invaders, also inadvertently facilitated the spread of illness. Close quarters, poor ventilation, and a lack of understanding about disease transmission created the perfect breeding ground for epidemics. Think of the castle as a petri dish, teeming with a potent cocktail of pathogens. The lack of sanitation, discussed earlier, was not simply a matter of discomfort. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. Imagine the overflowing chamber pots, their contents emptied infrequently, leaching their foul contents into the very foundations of the castle. Add to this the absence of proper sewage systems, and you have a recipe for disaster. The stench, as I mentioned earlier, was legendary, but it was merely a symptom of a far greater problem: the lurking presence of disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and influenza were frequent visitors to royal courts, decimating the population with alarming regularity. These weren't mere inconveniences, they were life threatening illnesses that often resulted in lingering disabilities or death. For medieval royalty, illness wasn't a temporary setback, it was a disruption of courtly life, a threat to power, and a constant reminder of mortality. A king or queen, incapacitated by illness, could easily become a target for ambitious rivals. One particular incident, though possibly apocryphal, vividly illustrates the dangers lurking within the opulent setting of a royal court. Picture this: a grand banquet, candles flickering, goblets filled with spiced wine, the air thick with the aroma of roasted meats and something else. Something subtly sour, something that would later prove deadly. A poisoned goblet, a simple act of treachery veiled in the elaborate rituals of courtly life. Our fictional protagonist, let's call him Lord Elmsworth, because it sounds suitably medieval, felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest shortly after consuming the wine. He initially dismissed it as indigestion, a common complaint in an era where food preservation was far from perfect. However, the pain intensified, accompanied by chills and violent shivering. His skin turned clammy, his breathing became labored, and his once robust physique quickly deteriorated. The royal physician, a man whose medical expertise likely involved more superstition than science, diagnosed, well, he wasn't quite sure. A humoral imbalance, he mumbled, perhaps referring to the medieval belief that an excess of particular bodily fluids could trigger disease. Lord Elmsworth's ailment quickly spread, like wildfire through dry brush. Other courtiers, who had partaken of the same wine, began exhibiting similar symptoms. The once vibrant atmosphere of the court was replaced by a chilling pall of fear and uncertainty. The castle, usually bustling with activity, now echoed with the coughs and groans of the afflicted. This fictional event mirrors countless historical accounts of outbreaks within royal courts. The rapid spread of the illness, the uncertainty surrounding its cause, and the desperate attempts to treat it reflect the challenges faced by medieval societies in combating disease. The lack of understanding about germ theory meant that treatments were often ineffective, and the focus was typically on purging the body of supposed harmful substances, a process that could actually worsen the patient's condition. Imagine the scene: bleeding, purging, and the application of bizarre concoctions made from questionable ingredients. The royal physician, overwhelmed and possibly terrified by the severity of the situation, might have prescribed bloodletting, a practice that involved draining significant amounts of blood from the patient, ironically further weakening them and making them more susceptible to infection. Herbs, roots, and other remedies were employed with varying degrees of success, sometimes making matters worse than if left alone. The concept of quarantine was in its infancy, if it existed at all in the practical sense. The spread of disease was often as unpredictable as the treatments meant to combat them. The aftermath of the outbreak reveals a grim truth about medieval court life. The lack of sanitation, combined with the close quarters, resulted in the rapid spread of disease. The deaths of several courtiers, possibly including Lord Elmsworth, served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life within those imposing castle walls. The incident casts a shadow on the otherwise extravagant splendor of court life, a reminder that even the most powerful were at the mercy of disease. The poisoned goblet may have been a deliberate act of malice or a cruel twist of fate, but the unsanitary conditions within the castle provided the perfect environment for the disease to spread. The story of Lord Elmsworth, while fictional, serves as a chilling illustration of the real-life struggles faced by medieval royalty. The outbreak was not simply a personal tragedy. It was a societal crisis that exposed the vulnerabilities of a system unprepared to deal with the threat of disease. The tale reveals the unsanitary conditions, the limitations of medieval medicine, and the ever-present threat of contagion that lurked beneath the veneer of royal luxury. It's a reminder that even amidst the splendor and intrigue of court life, death could come swiftly and unexpectedly, highlighting the stark contrast between the romanticized image of the medieval period and the grim realities of daily existence. The lack of understanding about the causes of disease had a profound impact on the responses to outbreaks. The focus was often on supernatural explanations, with blame placed on witchcraft, divine punishment, or other mystical forces, while some attempts at treatment involved herbal remedies or rudimentary surgical procedures. These methods were largely ineffective and sometimes even counterproductive. The absence of effective prevention strategies, combined with unsanitary living conditions, made the spread of disease an almost inevitable occurrence. Consider the sheer density of the population within the confines of a castle where courtiers, servants, and the royal family lived in close proximity. The lack of personal hygiene, combined with the sharing of common utensils, bedding, and other resources, created a potent vector for the transmission of pathogens. The concept of isolation or quarantine, as we understand it today, was largely absent, contributing to the rapid spread of infections. In the aftermath of an outbreak, there was often a frantic scramble to identify the source of the disease. This often involved attributing the illness to external factors, such as poisoned food or drink, or even accusations of witchcraft or sorcery. These explanations were based on the lack of understanding of microbial agents as the cause of disease. The focus was on symptomatic relief rather than on the underlying cause of the illness. Even if the source of the illness was identified, there were few effective treatments available. Bloodletting, purging, and the application of various herbal remedies were common practices, but their effectiveness was questionable at best. The absence of antibiotics and other modern medical interventions meant that the outcome of many illnesses was largely determined by the body's own immune response. Mortality rates were high, and those who survived often suffered long-term health consequences. The story of courtly intrigue and disease is not merely a tale of sickness and death. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It is a narrative that reveals the limitations of a bygone era while highlighting the advancements made in modern medicine and sanitation. It's a story where even the most powerful were vulnerable, where the glamorous facade of court life masked a brutal reality, and where the battle against disease was fought not only with remedies and superstition, but also with courage and a grim determination to survive, and perhaps a little bit of dark humor to help cope with the sheer unpleasantness of it all. Let's face it, the medieval period wasn't exactly known for its chill political climate. Forget the Game of Thrones dragons and meticulously crafted CGI. The real medieval power struggles were far more pungent. Imagine a world where your rivals weren't just plotting your demise with poisoned wine, though that certainly happened, but also battling dysentery while doing so. The sheer lack of hygiene added a truly unique layer of complexity to these political games. A strategically placed chamber pot could be as effective a weapon as a well-aimed dagger. The court was a pressure cooker of ambition, where alliances shifted faster than the weather in England. Kings and queens, burdened with the weight of their crowns and the constant threat of illness, played a deadly game of chess with human lives as pawns. Let's explore some of the less glamorous, more odoriferous aspects of this royal game. Consider the sheer logistics of power. Messages took weeks, even months to travel. News often arrived stale, outdated, and frequently misrepresented, a bit like the game of telephone, only with potentially fatal consequences. A messenger's untimely demise from dysentery could mean the delay or complete loss of a critical strategic missive, creating a ripple effect of chaos. Then there's the sheer drama of royal inheritance. Was the king's sickly heir actually his son? Did the queen's loyal ladies-in-waiting secretly support her rivals? It wasn't uncommon for powerful families to jockey for position, whispering sweet nothings to the king while simultaneously plotting his downfall and using his illness as a catalyst for their ambition. Imagine a courtly gathering where polite smiles masked deeply rooted animosities. A seemingly innocent cough could be a strategic move, a feigned illness to subtly hint at the vulnerability of the current monarch. Let's delve into some specific examples of medieval political maneuvering. Take the case of, let's call him, King Theodore III. Poor Theodore was plagued by gout, a condition that must have made wearing medieval armor even more uncomfortable. He was a man of considerable girth, whose mobility was severely limited. This physical limitation played directly into the hands of his ambitious younger brother, who had a penchant for plotting rebellion as opposed to participating in the traditional noble pastime of hunting. This younger brother, let's call him Prince Bartholomew, because it sounds suitably villainous, skillfully leveraged the king's ailment. While Theodore struggled to even mount his horse, Bartholomew spent his time rallying support amongst the disgruntled nobles. He presented himself as a more able, active ruler, even going so far as to publicly demonstrate his robust physical condition by participating in jousting tournaments, though the historians note that Bartholomew conveniently won every match. The juxtaposition worked brilliantly. Theodore, a man groaning under the weight of his crown and gout, versus Bartholomew, a picture of youthful vigor and seemingly endless energy. Bartholomew's campaign was subtle, a masterclass in indirect political warfare. He carefully cultivated relationships with key members of the court, subtly undermining the king's authority by suggesting solutions to Theodore's problems that ultimately benefited himself. He used the king's illness as a cover for his actions, ensuring the royal council was so distracted by Theodore's health that they didn't notice the subtle power shift happening, but Bartholomew's plans nearly went awry. A timely outbreak of the plague in the royal court forced the king to take to his bed in earnest, further fueling concerns about the king's ability to rule. In a stroke of misfortune, or brilliance depending on your point of view, Bartholomew himself contracted a mild case of the ailment. This allowed him to demonstrate his leadership by nursing his ailing brother back to relative health and cleverly garnering immense sympathy from the court and the common folk. This near-death experience transformed Bartholomew from a scheming prince into a compassionate savior. He recovered remarkably quickly, capitalizing on his recovered health to solidify his position as his brother's heir apparent. After King Theodore's death, from natural causes, or so the court records claim, Bartholomew smoothly ascended to the throne, his rule solidified by the successful manipulation of the unfortunate circumstance. It's important to remember that these events weren't solely about poison and daggers. The backdrop of disease, poor sanitation, and rudimentary medicine made the political game even more precarious. Imagine the stress on the king, not only the constant threat of assassination, but also the fear of contracting a deadly illness from a seemingly harmless handshake or an ill-prepared royal feast. The very air in the castle felt heavy with intrigue and the smell of something distinctly unpleasant. The medieval court wasn't just a stage for political battles, it was a petri dish where ambition, disease, and the stench of decay often mingled in a particularly toxic brew. Every cough, every sudden fever could signal not only illness, but a shift in political power. A simple case of dysentery could unintentionally dismantle a carefully crafted plot, or conversely, become a tool for a power-hungry individual to rise to the top. The medieval political game was certainly intense, but it certainly lacked the visual flair of CGI dragons. The real drama was far more subtly played out in the coughs, the fevers, the strategically placed chamber pots, and the shifting alliances of a court struggling to survive amidst disease and deadly intrigue. It's a world where even a healthy stomach was a significant political advantage. One should also consider the role of the royal advisors and the council. These individuals, while appearing to serve the monarch, often had their own agendas. They could use the king's illness as leverage, either to advance their personal ambitions or to support favored factions within the court. The king, weakened by illness, would become susceptible to their manipulations, easily steered towards decisions that favored their interests. Even courtly etiquette became a weapon. A slight, a poorly timed bow, a seemingly insignificant omission from a royal decree. These minor acts could carry significant political weight. The rules of the court were more than simply social norms. They were the intricate mechanisms of a power play, meticulously designed and exploited for political gain. The power of propaganda wasn't invented in modern times. Medieval monarchs and their rivals understood the importance of shaping public perception. The image of a strong, healthy king was crucial. The appearance of wellness, even when battling severe illnesses, was carefully cultivated and amplified by court artists and royal historians to ensure the support of the population and deter any ambitious rivals. The constant threat of rebellion loomed large over every monarch. Dissatisfied nobles and ambitious families were always looking for an opportunity to seize power. This provided another layer to the political game, as the king not only had to battle external enemies, but also navigate the complex web of relationships within his own court. The threat of illness, with its debilitating effects, only served to increase the king's vulnerability and provide further opportunities for ambitious challengers. The interplay between illness and power was a recurring theme throughout medieval history. The death of a king, often precipitated by disease, would throw the kingdom into turmoil, triggering power struggles and often leading to war and violence. This inherent instability in the chain of succession was frequently exploited by ambitious courtiers, making the royal court a truly volatile environment. But even with the dire consequences, one can't deny the darkly comedic aspects of it all. Imagine a royal council meeting, punctuated by coughs, the lingering scent of unwashed bodies, and the whispered plotting of rival factions. It's a scene filled with desperation, ambition, and a healthy dose of medieval bodily functions. The seemingly endless battles against both enemies and the sheer unpleasantness of medieval life add a surprisingly funny undercurrent to the grim reality. The combination of high-stakes political games with the inconvenient realities of medieval existence makes the historical record a fascinating, if somewhat revolting, read. The medieval world, even in its regal form, was messy, unsanitary, and often absurd. It was a world where the throne was as likely to be claimed through cunning manipulation and a bit of good luck as through brute force. And while the dragons and CGI might be absent from the historical record, the drama, the intrigue, and the sheer unadulterated craziness were far more captivating in their own right. It's a testament to human resilience and the enduring human desire for power, played out amidst some truly remarkable and unpleasant circumstances. The medieval world was a place where the stakes were high, the hygiene was low, and the humor was often darkly, tragically ironic. Let's shift our focus from the treacherous political landscape of the medieval court to something equally treacherous, royal fashion. Forget the shimmering silks and elegant gowns often depicted in romanticized portrayals. The reality was considerably less glamorous. Imagine a world where haute couture meant layers upon layers of heavy fabrics, designed more for visual impact than comfort or practicality. We're talking about garments so stiff and restrictive, they'd make a modern-day corset seem like a comfortable t-shirt. Our story begins, not with a king or queen, but with the unsung hero, or perhaps anti-hero, of the medieval court, the royal tailor. Let's call him Thomas, a man whose life was a constant battle against stiff fabrics, impossible deadlines, and the ever-present risk of royal displeasure. Thomas wasn't just stitching together clothes. He was constructing an elaborate facade, a visual representation of royal power and authority. But behind the dazzling exterior of jeweled embroidery and heavy brocades lay a world of discomfort and sheer impracticality. Picture Thomas, hunched over his workbench, surrounded by bolts of heavy velvet, stiff linen, and enough gold thread to bankrupt a small kingdom. He's wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of fabric, a richly embroidered tapestry intended for the king's new robe. The material is so thick and ornate that it barely bends, let alone drapes. Thomas sighs. The king, notorious for his ample girth, has just gained another stone, thanks perhaps to an overabundance of royal feasts that involved copious amounts of roasted meats, spiced wines, and suspiciously unwashed vegetables. This means Thomas needs to create new garments from scratch, and soon, lest he incur the royal wrath. And the king wasn't the only one presenting sartorial challenges. The queen, a woman of exquisite taste, but equally exquisite fragility, required gowns so heavily padded and structured they were practically wearable suits of armor. These gowns were intended to create a desired silhouette, a symbol of royal grace and elegance, but their actual effect was to severely restrict her movement, making even simple tasks a challenge. Imagine attempting to navigate the uneven cobblestone floors of a medieval castle wearing several layers of heavy fabric and yards of stiff material. A simple trip could mean humiliation, injury, and an extremely irritated queen. Thomas wasn't just battling the physical limitations of the fabrics. He was also wrestling with the vagaries of royal preferences. One day, the king favored bright, bold colors. The next, he'd demand somber hues. The queen, equally capricious, might decide on a sudden shift from flowing silks to stiff brocades, leaving Thomas scrambling to meet her whims. The only constant was the unwavering expectation of perfection. A single misplaced stitch, a slightly uneven hem, these minor imperfections could translate to a severe royal reprimand, potentially costing Thomas his job, his reputation, and perhaps even his life. Beyond the sartorial demands of the royal couple, Thomas also had to contend with the needs of the entire royal court. Princes, princesses, courtiers, and ladies-in-waiting, each with their own distinct preferences and styles, all depended on Thomas's expertise and skill. He needed to create countless garments, ensuring that each individual's clothing reflected their status and role within the court's complex hierarchy. Consider the sheer logistics involved, sourcing the materials, managing his assistants, and carefully stitching each garment to the utmost standards of medieval tailoring. The lack of hygiene was another significant challenge for Thomas. Imagine working with fabrics that were often months, even years old, and perhaps haven't been cleaned since the last royal event they were worn to. The materials were treated with various chemicals and substances to improve durability and add color, some of which left lingering smells and could cause irritation or even allergic reactions. Thomas's workshop was a peculiar blend of creativity and unsanitary conditions. And let's not forget the issue of body odor. Medieval hygiene standards were, to put it mildly, less stringent than those we have today. Regular bathing was not common among the ruling classes, making the royal garments often permeated with the aromas of unwashed bodies. It must have been a constant battle for Thomas to counteract these smells, attempting to mask the less pleasant scents with expensive perfumes and herbs. The task was nearly impossible. Royal fashion wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about power, status, and making a statement. The garments weren't just clothes. They were visual representations of wealth, authority, and social standing. Each intricate detail, from the type of fabric to the color and embroidery, carried symbolic weight. The more elaborate and expensive the garment, the higher the social status of the wearer. This emphasis on outward appearance often came at the expense of comfort, practicality, and ironically, hygiene. The very fabrics themselves were a source of discomfort. The heavy, stiff materials used in royal garments were often uncomfortable to wear, especially in the less than ideal climatic conditions of medieval castles. Imagine the stifling heat of summer, trapped within layers of thick velvet and brocade. Then there's the chill of winter, where the lack of proper insulation meant royal blood could have been as easily chilled as the stone walls surrounding them. The elaborate designs and embellishments of royal clothing further added to the discomfort. Intricate embroidery, heavy beading, and countless layers of fabrics often restricted movement and made even simple actions difficult. Imagine the struggle of a queen trying to mount her horse, or a king attempting to draw his sword, hampered by layers upon layers of heavy garments. The practicality of it all fell by the wayside, as aesthetics and the sheer desire to display wealth took precedence. And the weight of it all, royal garments often weighed many pounds, a constant physical burden for those wearing them. The weight wasn't just uncomfortable, it was also physically taxing. Consider the effort required to simply stand upright, let alone move, dance, or participate in any other activity. In essence, medieval royal fashion was a cruel joke, a visually stunning illusion of opulence that hid an uncomfortable reality. The garments that projected power and prestige also served as a constant reminder of the physical limitations and unsanitary conditions of life within the castle walls. Thomas, the royal tailor, was a key figure in this grand deception, a master of illusion who crafted garments that spoke volumes about their wearer's status, but whispered uncomfortable truths about the medieval world. His life, much like the lives of the kings and queens he served, was a tapestry woven with threads of opulence, discomfort, and the ever-present stench of an era that prized appearance above all else, even comfort and hygiene. The very idea of a royal flush took on a different meaning altogether. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the stone walls of the castle, signaling the end of another chaotic day. For the royal family, however, the day's end brought little respite. The very notion of a royal night's rest was a cruel joke, a stark contrast to the luxurious image often portrayed in tapestries and paintings. Their chambers, while undeniably grand in scale, were far from havens of peaceful slumber. Imagine, if you will, the king's bedchamber. Large, yes, opulent even, but far from comfortable. The bed itself, a monumental structure of carved wood and heavy fabrics, was far less inviting than it appeared. Forget memory foam. We're talking about a mountain of straw and feathers, encased in layers of linen and wool that felt about as welcoming as a pile of rocks. The sheer weight of the bedding alone was enough to make even the most robust king feel suffocated. And the straw? Let's just say it was a constant companion to fleas, bedbugs, and the occasional mouse. Royal blood certainly ran through their veins, but so did a fair share of vermin. The lack of personal space was another notable feature of the royal sleeping quarters. The king's chamber wasn't just a bedroom. It often served as a makeshift office, a meeting room, and occasionally a temporary storage facility. Important documents, half-eaten feasts left over from grand banquets, and assorted advisors clutching scrolls, all shared space with His Royal Majesty in his chamber. Privacy? A laughable concept. The thin, drafty walls offered little protection from the clamor of the castle. The sounds of guards patrolling the corridors, the distant barking of dogs, and the incessant chatter of servants all combined to create a cacophony of noise that would rival any modern-day construction site. Restful sleep was a luxury reserved for the very fortunate. And then there were the drafts. Oh, the drafts. Medieval castles, magnificent though they were notoriously drafty. Chilly winds whistled through cracks in the walls and under ill-fitting doors, sending shivers down even the most resilient spines. The king might have been accustomed to the cold, but it was little consolation on those long, dark nights. Even with layers of heavy blankets, the chill seeped through, making for a far less than luxurious night's rest. The queen's chambers weren't much better. While perhaps slightly more refined than the king's quarters, the same issues of discomfort, noise, and lack of privacy persisted. Her bed, though equally imposing, offered little in the way of comfort. The queen, with her delicate constitution, might have found some respite in soft furs and luxurious bedding, had it not been for the pervasive dampness of the castle walls, making the luxurious materials feel clammy and uncomfortable. In addition to the lack of comfort, both the king and queen faced the ever-present threat of intruders. The castle walls might have provided protection from outside threats, but within the walls, danger was a constant companion. Intrigue, betrayal, and assassination attempts were not uncommon, leading to a persistent sense of unease and insecurity. The thought of a would-be assassin creeping through the corridors, seeking an opportunity to strike, wasn't exactly conducive to a restful night's sleep. Furthermore, illness was a persistent threat. The unsanitary conditions that plagued medieval life, particularly within the confines of the castle, contributed to the prevalence of disease. Lack of hygiene, poor ventilation, and overcrowded living spaces created the ideal environment for infections to spread rapidly. A coughing fit in the middle of the night could signal anything from a common cold to a deadly plague, keeping both the king and queen in a constant state of unease. And what about the chamber pots? These, along with the lingering sense of unwashed bodies and stale food, added another layer to the less than ideal sleeping environment. While the royal chamber pots were likely emptied and cleaned more frequently than those of the commoners, the very presence of them, along with the inevitable lingering smell, hardly contributed to a tranquil night. The entire castle was built for defense and royalty, not exactly for hygiene or comfort. The children of the royal household fared no better. Their chambers, though smaller, shared many of the same problems as their parents: the drafts, the noise, the lack of personal space, and the constant threat of illness. Sharing a room with siblings, tutors, and other attendants, they slept in a never-ending symphony of snores, coughs, and the rustle of fabrics. Their beds, too, were usually made of straw and feathers, with little in the way of cushioning. The experience of going to sleep was less a restful retreat and more a survival activity. One could argue that the medieval royal families slept not in beds, but in a state of perpetual vigilance. Their sleep, if they could manage to find any, was punctuated by anxieties over political intrigues, the threat of assassination, the damp chill that clung to the castle walls, and the fear of illness. Far from a luxurious retreat, a royal night's rest was an exercise in endurance and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The romantic notions of medieval royalty often ignored the reality. Their lives, even in their sleep, were less fairy tale and more a constant battle against discomfort, disease, and the ever present dangers of castle life. The phrase sleeping like a log took on a rather literal and far less comforting meaning in those times. In fact, sleeping like a royal was more comparable to sleeping on a bed of thorns, an uncomfortable, perilous situation that required a healthy dose of patience, fortitude, and perhaps a good nightcap of spiced wine to help dull the senses, even for a king, even for a queen. Chapter 3: Life Below Stairs. The echoing silence of the royal chambers, broken only by the occasional creak of aging wood or the distant rustle of a guard's uniform, was a stark contrast to the cacophony that reigned below stairs. Descending into the servants' quarters was like stepping into a different world, a world of cramped spaces, pungent odors, and unrelenting toil. Gone were the tapestries and polished floors. In their place were rough-hewn walls, dirt floors packed hard by years of footfalls, and an ever-present aroma that blended the smells of unwashed bodies, stale food, and something vaguely animalistic. Forget the spacious, airy bedrooms enjoyed by the nobility. The servants' quarters resembled a warren of tiny, interconnected rooms, each barely large enough to accommodate a cot and a meager chest. Several individuals, often men, women, and children from families, shared these cramped spaces. Privacy was a luxury unknown to them. Conversations, laughter, and the sounds of nightly routines were shared, not to mention the inevitable outbreaks of coughs and sneezes that echoed through the thin walls. Their shared lives created a strange form of community, a quiet solidarity born of mutual hardship. The beds, if you could call them that, were far removed from the feathered extravagance of the royals. Straw pallets, thin and uneven, served as sleeping surfaces, offering little comfort and less hygiene. Fleas and bedbugs were constant companions, their incessant nibbling a reminder of the grim realities of life below stairs. Blankets were often threadbare and patched, offering little protection from the persistent damp chill that permeated the stone walls. The daily routine of a castle servant was a brutal cycle of backbreaking labor. Their work started before dawn and stretched long into the night, leaving little time for anything beyond the bare necessities of existence. Their tasks ranged from cleaning and cooking with minimal ingredients, often spoiled, to laundry and tending to the needs of the royal family and their guests. A servant's life was a constant race against time, a struggle to keep up with the endless demands of a medieval household. Cleaning, in particular, was a Sisyphean task. The sheer size of the castle, combined with the primitive cleaning tools available, meant that grime and dirt were always present. Imagine scrubbing floors with stiff brushes and cold water, scrubbing away a perpetual layer of grease and food splatters that even the most vigorous scrubbing could never entirely remove. The castle's many fireplaces created a constant film of soot, turning even the most pristine surfaces into blackened eyesores within a matter of hours. And water, such a commodity in the modern world, was a precious resource, limited and carefully rationed. A servant would sometimes travel distances to retrieve water to do their jobs, a task in itself that demanded energy. The kitchen was another realm of chaos. Preparing meals for the many inhabitants of the castle was a monumental undertaking. They would spend hours chopping vegetables, tending ovens, and preparing endless stews and porridges, often working in cramped conditions with limited ventilation. The heat of the ovens, the smoke, and the lack of sanitation created an oppressive environment. Yet somehow, these servants transformed humble ingredients into meals for a household that would make most culinary schools feel very inadequate. The disposal of waste was another constant concern. The castle lacked modern sanitation systems, and chamber pots were the norm. Emptying and cleaning these was a particularly unpleasant task, which fell largely to the less favored servants. The stench of human waste was a constant reminder of the unsanitary conditions that were integral to medieval life, and was particularly strong in the servants' quarters. Even the royals endured the smell occasionally, and they had the luxury of relative distance from the problem. Disease was an ever-present threat. The crowded living quarters, poor hygiene, and lack of medical care created the perfect breeding ground for infections. A simple scratch could lead to a life-threatening infection. A common cold could escalate into something far worse. While the royal family had access to somewhat better medicine and care, the servants were on their own, relying on folk remedies and herbal concoctions that often proved ineffective. Death, sadly, wasn't uncommon, and the cyclical nature of life meant new servants had to be found to replace those lost to sickness or injury. Despite these harsh realities, a sense of camaraderie and shared experience forged a bond between the servants. They relied on each other for support, sharing stories, food, and occasional moments of laughter. They found solace in their shared misery, understanding the burdens that each carried. The younger servants learned from the elders, transmitting generations' worth of practical knowledge and strategies for survival. They shared their hardship with a resigned empathy that stemmed from their shared experiences, often creating a kind of strange family among those who would be unlikely to find one otherwise. Through these informal systems of support, they managed to weather the storms that came and go in their lives. After all, who else would understand the challenges of emptying a royal chamber pot at 3 in the morning, except those who had done it repeatedly? Yet, it wasn't all misery and despair. There were moments of joy, of shared laughter and camaraderie amidst the drudgery. Secret games played in the dimly lit corners of the quarters, hushed conversations, songs sung in low voices to fight against the misery. These small moments of respite, small embers of warmth amid cold stone, were vital to maintaining spirits and to keeping the human connection that so many desperately needed. The servants' struggles weren't just about survival. They were also about subtle resistance. They developed ingenious strategies for making life bearable. For example, devising ways to obtain extra food, securing slightly better sleeping arrangements, and creating a support network to ensure each member's well-being. While not openly rebellious, these actions represented a quiet form of defiance, a way of carving out a little space for themselves within the suffocating constraints of castle life. Their strategies to survive weren't just practical responses to harsh environments, they were symbols of a quiet courage. Their lives were a stark contrast to the often romanticized depictions of medieval castles. While the nobility enjoyed a life of relative privilege, the servants toiled in obscurity, their contributions essential but often overlooked. Their experiences reveal a less glamorous reality than many people imagine, offering a sobering reminder of the vast disparities in wealth, status, and living conditions that existed within the medieval world. Their lives were less about tales of romance and heroism, and more about a constant struggle for survival and a quiet strength in the face of constant adversity. The servants' quarters, far from being merely a backdrop to the lives of the nobility, were a world unto themselves, a microcosm of medieval life marked by both the utter squalor and the surprising strength of the human spirit, a testament to resilience and community forged in the harshest of conditions. The castle kitchen, a cavernous space perpetually clouded in a haze of smoke and steam, was a far cry from the gleaming stainless steel and modern appliances of a contemporary culinary establishment. Imagine instead a vast, soot stained hearth dominating one end, its roaring flames licking at massive iron pots suspended above. The air hung heavy with the smells of roasting meats, simmering stews, and something vaguely indescribable, a pungent blend of herbs, spices, and the lingering aroma of 100 different meals passed. The kitchen staff, a motley crew of cooks, scullions, and kitchen maids, worked in a frenetic ballet of controlled chaos. Their movements were honed by years of practice, a seamless choreography of chopping, stirring, and carrying that allowed them to navigate the cramped space with surprising efficiency. Each person had their assigned tasks, a carefully orchestrated system designed to maximize output within the limitations of the medieval kitchen. The head cook, usually a gruff, experienced individual who'd likely seen more than their fair share of kitchen disasters, oversaw the operation with an iron fist. He or she was responsible for managing the inventory, planning the menus, and ensuring that the meals were prepared on time and to the satisfaction of the lord and lady of the castle. This wasn't a simple task. Medieval recipes were notoriously vague, relying on measurements like a handful or a pinch, leaving much to the cook's experience and intuition. The cooks themselves were skilled artisans, transforming the simplest of ingredients into elaborate dishes that would amaze, perhaps despite the questionable hygiene. Their repertoire included a wide variety of stews, pottages, and roasted meats, each carefully seasoned with a blend of herbs and spices that, according to modern standards, might have ranged from surprisingly sophisticated to utterly bizarre. Remember, there were no refrigerators, so preserving food was a major undertaking. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying were the primary methods used to prevent spoilage. The scullions, typically the younger and less experienced members of the kitchen staff, performed the menial tasks, peeling vegetables, cleaning pots and pans, and carrying water from the well or stream. They were the unsung heroes of the kitchen, the ones who tirelessly toiled behind the scenes, ensuring that the cooks had the necessary ingredients and tools to perform their magic. The kitchen maids, often the daughters of servants, would assist with various aspects, from preparation and serving to general tidiness. Their roles varied widely depending on the needs of the castle and the inclination of the head cook. The meals prepared for the nobility were often lavish affairs, showcasing the wealth and status of the castle's inhabitants. Roasted boar, pheasant, and venison were commonplace, often accompanied by elaborate pastries, spiced wines, and an array of fruits and nuts that would be the envy of any modern-day buffet. These feasts were carefully orchestrated spectacles, a display of power and opulence intended to impress guests and reinforce the authority of the ruling family. The presentation was as important as the taste, and the servers were well trained in the art of formal service. However, the stark contrast between the lavish feasts of the nobility and the meager rations of the servants was striking. While the lords and ladies feasted on delicacies, the kitchen staff made do with leftovers, scraps, and whatever other ingredients could be salvaged from the day's preparations. Bread, often stale and hard, formed the staple of their diet, supplemented by occasional vegetables, grains, and whatever bits of meat remained after the main feasts. A common meal for them would be something more akin to a basic stew made up of vegetables and any leftover bits of meat that had been cooked for the main event. The broth would probably be more water than anything else, but even the seemingly humble rations required a level of creativity and resourcefulness that would impress any modern-day chef. The servants developed their own ingenious methods for stretching ingredients, creating flavorful dishes from what others might have considered waste. A clever cook might transform leftover bones and scraps into a hearty broth, adding herbs and spices to mask the somewhat questionable origins of the ingredients. Stale bread could be crumbled and used to thicken soups, or repurposed into bread pudding, a dessert that was far more nutritious than it might have appeared. The kitchen was not just a place of work, it was also a place of community. The long hours and shared struggles forged a sense of camaraderie among the kitchen staff, a bond strengthened by their shared experiences and mutual reliance. They shared stories, jokes, and sometimes even food, creating a small haven of support within the larger, often unforgiving world of the castle. The rhythms of the kitchen dictated their lives, the relentless cycle of preparation, cooking, and cleaning, a never-ending dance with fire, smoke, and the ever-present aroma of food. Their work was physically demanding, emotionally draining, and often dangerous. A misplaced knife, a spilled pot of boiling water, or a sudden surge of flames could easily result in injury. But they persevered, finding a strange sort of satisfaction in their work, a quiet pride in their ability to transform basic ingredients into nourishment for the castle's inhabitants. Their lives were far removed from the romanticized images of medieval castles that often populate books and films. There were no gallant knights or damsels in distress, only the endless cycle of work and the constant challenge of eking out a living in a world where sanitation was a luxury and food security was a constant worry. Their story is one of quiet resilience, of adapting to limitations, of community and survival despite immense challenges. They were the unseen hands that kept the castle functioning, their work both vital and easily overlooked. Their culinary creativity, born out of necessity, turned their challenges into a silent triumph over poverty and scarcity. It's a culinary history seldom told, a story hidden amidst the grand narratives of medieval kings and queens. But it's a story, nonetheless, worth remembering and one that deserves far more than scraps. Leaving the relative controlled chaos of the castle kitchen, we descend further into the bowels of the medieval castle, a journey not for the faint of heart or stomach, for while the kitchen offered a potent blend of aromas, the rest of the castle provided a pungent, olfactory experience, best described as a symphony of decay. Let's talk sanitation, or rather, the spectacular absence thereof. Forget pristine bathrooms and efficient sewage systems. Medieval sanitation was, to put it mildly, a work in progress, a work that, frankly, never quite got off the ground. Imagine, if you will, a world where the concept of a toilet, as we know it, was utterly foreign. Chamber pots, those charming porcelain vessels of yesteryear, were the primary method of waste disposal. These were not pretty. They were, essentially, glorified buckets that sat strategically, or strategically not, beside beds, awaiting the call of nature. Emptying these delightful receptacles was, of course, not a task for the faint of heart or stomach. This duty, often relegated to the lowest ranking servants, a group whose living conditions already defied the word comfortable, involved navigating dimly lit corridors, often in the dead of night, armed with nothing but a chamber pot brimming with, well, you get the picture. The disposal method was equally unromantic. Contents were usually tossed out windows, occasionally into nearby ditches, or if the castle was built on a slope, unceremoniously tipped over the edge of the fortification. The resulting aroma was, let's just say, unforgettable. The castle walls, in other words, served as giant, porous, medieval air fresheners, the kind that smelled suspiciously of rotting things. Imagine the sheer volume of waste generated by even a modestly sized castle. Hundreds of people, all producing their fair share of contributions. Add to this the refuse from the kitchen, peelings, scraps, bones, and let's be honest, probably things that modern health inspectors would have a field day with. All this had to go somewhere, and that somewhere wasn't typically a neatly organized landfill. Instead, it accumulated in heaps, attracting rodents, insects, and all manner of unsavory creatures. These weren't just aesthetic issues, they were significant public health hazards. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was limited, to say the least. The concept of germs and bacteria was yet to be discovered. Illness was often attributed to miasma, bad air, or imbalances in the humors, those mysterious bodily fluids that governed health according to the theories of the time. As a result, diseases spread rapidly and relentlessly, aided and abetted by the aforementioned enthusiastic lack of sanitation. Consider the common cold. In a castle teeming with people and refuse, it was more like the common plague, a permanent resident rather than a temporary visitor. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, these weren't rare occurrences. They were, sadly, commonplace. Imagine the life of a servant, constantly exposed to these threats, working long hours in cramped, unsanitary conditions, sleeping in poorly ventilated quarters, and perpetually surrounded by the smells and sights of untreated waste. Their immune systems were constantly under siege. And of course, it wasn't simply the servants who suffered. The nobility, while enjoying more spacious accommodations, were not immune to the effects of poor sanitation. Though they had more access to fresh water and better food quality, this was only a partial shield against disease. Diseases like the bubonic plague, a nasty bacterial infection spread by fleas on rats, made no distinction between king and kitchen maid. A single infected rat could easily bring the entire castle to its knees, a scenario far more dramatic than any siege. One particular incident stands out in the annals of castle-related health disasters. In the year 1485, at the imposing Castle Blackwood, names have been changed to protect the extremely pungent. A particularly virulent strain of dysentery swept through the castle, striking both high and low. The symptoms were gruesome: relentless diarrhea, vomiting, fever, dehydration, and in the worst cases, death. The castle's privy, a euphemism for a rather unpleasant structure, overflowed, spewing its contents into the surrounding areas. The stench was said to be so overpowering that even the bravest knights choked and wept. The less brave? Well, let's just say their exit strategy involved a rather hasty retreat. The outbreak ravaged the castle. Servants fell ill by the dozens, many succumbing to the disease. The kitchen staff, already operating under difficult conditions, were reduced to a skeletal crew. Meals became sparse, and the lack of proper sanitation made preparing and serving food an almost unbearable task. Even the nobility were not spared. The castle lord, a robust man known for his appetite and boisterous laughter, was reduced to a trembling shadow of his former self, confined to his bed, his once gleaming armor gathering dust. His once lavish feasts were replaced by the sounds of labored breathing and the constant presence of physicians desperately trying, and mostly failing, to cure him. The story of Castle Blackwood's dysentery outbreak highlights the devastating consequences of medieval sanitation practices, or rather, the complete lack thereof. It was a stark contrast to our modern understanding of hygiene and disease control. Today, the presence of running water, sewage systems, and stringent health regulations is second nature to most. We have sophisticated ways to treat waste, understand how diseases spread, and develop preventative measures. We don't toss our waste out windows, and our immune systems aren't constantly battling a horde of pathogens that flourish in an environment where hygiene is, well, let's just say it leaves much to be desired. The castle servants' daily lives served as a constant reminder of the fragility of life in a pre-modern world, where a simple bout of diarrhea could quickly turn fatal. This was a far cry from the romanticized vision of medieval life, where noble knights and brave warriors strode through gleaming castles, free from the grime and stench of everyday reality. The truth, as is often the case, was far less glamorous and significantly more pungent. Their story is a testament to human resilience in the face of appalling conditions, a constant struggle for survival against odds that would make even the most seasoned survivalist reconsider their career choice. They endured, they cleaned up, literally and figuratively, and they kept the castle running, a silent tribute to human endurance, whispered amongst the echoes of chamber pots and the lingering scent of medieval misfortune. Their lives, though far from comfortable, certainly were memorable. But the castle wasn't just a battleground against disease and filth. It was also a surprisingly complex social microcosm. Life below stairs, while undeniably challenging, wasn't devoid of camaraderie, conflict, and even romance. The servants, bound together by their shared hardships and proximity, formed a close-knit community with its own intricate social dynamics. Imagine, if you will, a medieval version of Downton Abbey, only with significantly less linen and significantly more aroma. The kitchen, the heart of the castle's operational system, and also its olfactory epicenter, was a particularly fertile ground for social interaction. Here, amidst the clatter of pots and pans, the sizzle of meat, and the perpetual cloud of steam, servants forged friendships based on shared tasks and mutual support. The older cooks, grizzled veterans of countless feasts and kitchen disasters, imparted their wisdom and their most effective methods for dealing with overly demanding nobles to the younger apprentices. These were bonds forged not just in shared labor, but in mutual understanding and respect for the sheer stamina required to survive a day in a medieval kitchen. Imagine the whispered conversations, the clandestine sharing of scraps, the subtle sabotage of unpopular colleagues' dishes, a pinch of something extra spicy here, a dash of something unexpectedly bitter there. The kitchen wasn't just a workplace, it was a social hub where news traveled faster than the plague rats. Gossip, that ancient and essential lubricant of social interaction, flowed freely, carrying tales of romantic entanglements, marital woes, and the latest scandalous rumors from upstairs. The cooks, with their intimate knowledge of the castle's inner workings, were often the primary source of this vital information, carefully dispensing it in strategic drips and drabs to those who earned their trust. Beyond the kitchen, life in the servant quarters was similarly vibrant. The cramped sleeping arrangements fostered a sense of intimacy, if not always privacy. The rhythmic snoring of one's roommate was the soundtrack to their lives. Shared hardships, including cold nights, dwindling food supplies, and the occasional rat infestation, bound them together in a way that few modern social bonds ever could. This wasn't always harmonious, of course. Arguments over blankets, spilled chamber pots, and the eternal question of whose turn it was to clean the latrines were common occurrences. But these disputes, however heated, were a testament to the very bonds that held them together. They were family, a dysfunctional, often smelly family, but family nonetheless. Rivalries, too, played a significant role in servant life. Competition for favor with the nobility, for better tasks, or even for a more comfortable sleeping arrangement could turn friendships into bitter feuds. These rivalries often manifested in subtle ways. A strategically placed obstruction in a hallway, a misplaced object that ruined a noble's carefully planned attire, or most effectively, a well-placed whisper to the castle's gossip queen. Such actions, however, carried risks. The consequences of crossing the wrong person could range from petty annoyances to genuine peril. But amidst the backbiting and bickering, there was also romance. The castle's servants, like people everywhere, fell in love. Secret glances exchanged across the crowded kitchen, stolen moments of intimacy under the cover of darkness, whispered promises under the stars. These were just some of the ways that love blossomed below stairs. These relationships, often fraught with the challenges of social hierarchy and the ever-present threat of disapproval from above, provided a vital source of comfort and companionship in a world that rarely provided either. One such romance was that of Thomas, the scullery boy, and Agnes, the lady-in-waiting's maid. Thomas, a quiet and shy lad, was smitten with Agnes, a quick-witted and fiercely independent young woman. Their courtship was a delicate dance of stolen moments and furtive glances. Their clandestine meetings took place in the moonlit courtyard, far from the prying eyes of the castle's inhabitants. Their love story, although simple, was a beacon of hope in a world of harsh realities. Their love affair, though, wasn't without its challenges. Agnes's position as a maid to a high-ranking noblewoman presented a significant obstacle to their romance. Any hint of their relationship could lead to serious repercussions for both of them. Yet, their love persisted, strengthened by their shared struggles and their secret moments of joy. Their romance, though, underscored the stark reality that their relationship, like much of their lives, was a constant gamble, a precarious balance between happiness and hardship. In contrast to Thomas and Agnes's quiet romance, the relationship between William, the castle blacksmith, and Matilda, the baker, was far more boisterous. William, a man of considerable size and even greater strength, was known for his booming laughter and his even louder arguments with the castle's steward. Matilda, petite but fiercely independent, matched him argument for argument, often besting him in wit and ingenuity. Their relationship was a constant barrage of playful banter, insults, and hearty laughter, a testament to the fact that love could often be found in the most unexpected places. Their relationship, too, had its challenges. The blacksmith's duties kept him toiling late into the night, while Matilda's schedule was dictated by the whims of the castle's inhabitants. Their courtship was a series of stolen kisses, snatched moments between work and clandestine meals. But their resilience, their ability to find moments of joy and affection amidst the daily grind of castle life, solidified their love. The servants' social lives, therefore, were a complex tapestry woven with threads of friendship, rivalry, romance, and hardship. Their world, while lacking in the comforts and luxuries of the nobles above, was far from static or uninteresting. It was a world of whispers and secrets, of laughter and tears, of camaraderie and conflict. A world that, despite its challenges, thrived on the resilience and ingenuity of its inhabitants. They found joy, love, and support in their shared struggles, in their shared trials and tribulations. Amidst the odors and the challenges of medieval life, they created a community, a messy, often hilarious, and deeply human community that endured. Their story is a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, humanity's capacity for connection, for love, and for a good laugh endures. The dark humor of their lives wasn't a denial of hardship, but a coping mechanism, a way to survive the stench, the disease, and the sheer drudgery of their existence. Their laughter echoed through the castle walls, a testament to the enduring human spirit, a sound often louder than the king's pronouncements, and far more memorable. They were the unsung heroes of the castle, the true backbone of this imposing stone structure, and their story, though often overlooked, deserves to be told and to be enjoyed with a healthy dose of dark amusement. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the castle grounds, but for the servants, the day was far from over. Their work might have concluded, the dishes washed, the floors scrubbed, the nobles' bedchambers meticulously tidied, but their own personal battles against fatigue and the ever-present chill of the castle were only just beginning. Sleep, that elusive balm for weary bodies and minds, was a luxury often denied to them. Their sleeping quarters, typically located in cramped, poorly lit spaces in the castle's depths, were anything but peaceful sanctuaries. Imagine a scene reminiscent of a medieval-era dormitory, albeit one where the aroma of lavender and rose petals was replaced by the more pungent scents of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and, let's be honest, the lingering ghost of yesterday's supper. These rooms, frequently overcrowded, were shared amongst several servants, resulting in a symphony of snores, coughs, and the occasional muffled complaint about a cramped sleeping space or a particularly aggressive bed bug. Privacy was a concept almost entirely unknown. The thin wooden partitions offered minimal sound insulation, so the whispered secrets, disgruntled sighs, and the occasional midnight quarrel between roommates provided a constant soundtrack to their sleep, or lack thereof. One could easily overhear conversations about everything from the latest castle gossip to the seemingly insurmountable problem of acquiring enough decent ale to make the upcoming feast's aftermath remotely bearable. The experience was less like a quiet night's rest and more like attending a very poorly rehearsed play where the audience was forced to participate. The beds themselves were far from luxurious. Straw pallets, often infested with unwelcome guests, and we're not talking about the friendly sort, were the norm. A thick woolen blanket, if one was lucky enough to possess one in working order, provided little warmth against the icy drafts that slithered through the stone walls. The comfort level was roughly equivalent to sleeping on a pile of slightly damp, scratchy hay under a leaky roof. And forget about those romantic notions of snuggling up close to a lover for warmth. The reality was more akin to a jostling pile of slightly grubby human bodies, all vying for what little space and warmth was available. Despite the discomfort, a certain camaraderie evolved out of this shared hardship. The servants, bound together by their shared adversity and close proximity, developed a unique bond that defied the social hierarchy they endured. They became a makeshift family, united by their collective exhaustion, the pungent smells of their communal sleeping quarters, and the shared need for a slightly better tomorrow. Their nighttime conversations, even amidst the coughs, snores, and occasional arguments, took on a more intimate and revealing tone than those shared during their bustling workdays. It was during these quiet, or rather not so quiet hours, that the true strength of their community shone through. Those who had an extra blanket would discreetly offer a corner of it to a shivering roommate. Those with better access to food resources might share a piece of bread or a bit of cheese with a hungrier companion. This was a silent exchange, often passed under the cover of darkness, yet it spoke volumes about the depth of their mutual respect and compassion. In their shared poverty and suffering, a form of silent empathy blossomed, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their conversations, far from being idle gossip, were often practical. They shared tips on how to survive the coming day, how to navigate the whims of the nobility, how to manage their meager resources, and how to avoid the wrath of the castle's notoriously irritable steward. These weren't just practical discussions, they were survival strategies. The collective knowledge and experience shared during those late night exchanges were as valuable as any formal training. Even amidst the complaints about the chilly nights and the incessant snoring, laughter often punctuated the darkness. Stories, jokes, and shared anecdotes passed down through generations of servants provided a much needed escape from the harsh realities of their lives. Humor, that age old antidote to despair, was their weapon against the monotony and misery of their existence. These weren't the refined jokes of court jesters. These were more earthy, often crude, reflections of their everyday experiences, laced with a cynical wit that only those who understood the stark realities of castle life could truly appreciate. The resilience of these servants was truly remarkable. They faced relentless discomfort, little sleep, and the constant threat of illness and injury, yet they persevered. Their laughter, often echoing through the cramped quarters, was a defiant counterpoint to the grim conditions they endured, a testament to their indomitable spirit and capacity for finding joy amidst the misery. Their lives may have lacked the luxury and comfort of the nobility, but their bonds of friendship, their shared struggles, and their remarkable capacity for resilience proved that even in the darkest of corners, the human spirit could, and often did, shine brightly. Their laughter, their stories, their shared warmth, these were their silent victories against the oppressive realities of life below stairs. They were the unsung heroes of the castle, surviving not just through sheer grit, but through the shared strength of their community, a testament to the enduring power of human connection, even in the most challenging of circumstances. And it all unfolded, often in the dead of night, under the faint glow of a dying ember, within the ever-present scent of dust, damp wool, and the faint, yet surprisingly comforting aroma of shared adversity. Also, Chapter 4, The Fall and Rise of the Castle. The previous night's laughter, faint as the dying embers in the servants' quarters, felt like a distant memory as the siege horns shattered the dawn's fragile peace. The comforting aroma of shared adversity was swiftly replaced by the acrid tang of fear and the metallic scent of blood carried on the wind from the battlefield below. The idyllic image of a medieval castle, a romantic stronghold of chivalry, evaporated like morning mist before the grim realities of a protracted siege. Suddenly, the carefully balanced ecosystem of castle life, already precarious enough, collapsed into chaos. The comforting camaraderie amongst the servants, forged in the crucible of shared hardship, was tested as resources dwindled. The carefully rationed food supplies, already meager, were stretched thinner than a knight's patience after a 3-day march. The daily routine, once a predictable, if unpleasant, rhythm, was disrupted, replaced by the jarring sounds of siege engines and the constant gnawing anxiety of impending doom. The siege wasn't just a battle for control of stone and mortar. It was a brutal contest for survival against disease and deprivation. Imagine the scene. hundreds, perhaps thousands, crammed within the castle walls, their hygiene plummeting at an alarming rate. The already precarious sanitation situation, akin to a Victorian-era slum, but with less charm, now spiraled into a full-blown public health crisis. The chamber pots, usually emptied with a frequency determined more by necessity than aesthetic appeal, overflowed, their contents mingling with the mud and refuse that accumulated in the castle's less glamorous corners. The once dreaded bedbugs now seemed almost quaint in comparison to the lurking threat of typhus, dysentery, and a whole host of other medieval nasties. The castle, once a symbol of power and protection, was now a breeding ground for disease, a festering wound in the landscape. The irony, of course, was deliciously dark. These warriors, clad in impossibly impractical armor, skilled in the arts of swordsmanship and siege warfare, were utterly helpless against microscopic enemies. Their strength and training were useless against a foe invisible to the naked eye, yet far more deadly than any catapult or battering ram. One could almost picture the scene. A noble knight, his armor gleaming, valiantly defending the castle walls, only to succumb later that evening to dysentery, his final hours spent less in glorious combat and more wrestling with a particularly unpleasant bout of stomach cramps. His valiant charge, the clash of steel, the thunder of siege weapons, all rendered insignificant by a microscopic organism. A truly medieval downer ending. The daily struggles of the servants became exponentially more difficult. Their already backbreaking workload increased tenfold. Not only did they have to maintain their usual duties, cleaning, cooking, attending to the needs of the nobility, but they also had to deal with the added challenges of repairing damage caused by siege weapons, tending to the wounded, both human and animal, and trying to maintain a semblance of order amidst the growing chaos. Their shared quarters, already cramped and unsanitary, transformed into veritable petri dishes of disease. The thin wooden partitions offered little protection from the spread of infection. The laughter that once echoed through the rooms was replaced by hacking coughs, groaning bodies, and the mournful toll of the castle bell, announcing the death of another victim to the siege. The communal spirit, once a source of comfort, was now a double-edged sword, bringing shared suffering and increased risk of contagion. Consider the plight of the castle's water supply. Already a precious commodity during normal times, it was now under siege. Pun intended. Wells were poisoned or destroyed, streams contaminated, and the water sources that remained were overcrowded, leaving the inhabitants susceptible to waterborne diseases. The nobility might have access to some semblance of purified water, but for the servants and the commoners, the choice was often between contaminated water and dehydration. A truly delightful dilemma. Food, too, became a source of anxiety and contention. The carefully stockpiled provisions, which had seemed plentiful only weeks before, vanished at an alarming rate, leaving the castle population facing starvation. The food that remained was often spoiled, contaminated, or simply inedible. The noble lords and ladies might have feasted on meager rations of salted meat, but the servants often resorted to foraging whatever they could find, even resorting to eating the castle's less appetizing inhabitants. The line between bravery and eating your roommate's pet rat blurred significantly. The psychological impact of the siege shouldn't be overlooked. The constant bombardment, the fear of death, the deprivation, and the omnipresent threat of disease took a heavy toll on the castle's inhabitants. Morale plummeted and tensions flared as resources dwindled. The nobility's once imposing authority was weakened, their power reduced to mere desperation. Even the knights, once symbols of invincibility, became shadows of their former selves, haunted by the constant fear of death and the grim reality that their superior training offered no protection against the invisible enemy. The siege ultimately ended, not with a triumphant charge or a heroic last stand, but with a negotiated surrender, a grim treaty dictated by exhaustion and despair brought an end to the bloodshed, but the scars of the siege remained. The castle, ravaged by war and disease, was a hollow shell of its former glory. The living population bore the scars of both physical and psychological trauma. The vibrant laughter of the servants was replaced by a subdued whisper, a haunting echo of a community broken but not defeated. The tale of this siege is not one of valiant knights and glorious battles. It is a cautionary tale of how even the mightiest fortifications, the most skilled warriors, can succumb to the invisible enemy, disease. It is a stark reminder that the romantic image of the medieval castle hides a brutal reality. A world of cramped spaces, inadequate sanitation, and the ever-present threat of death, not just from swords and arrows, but from the far more insidious foes of disease and starvation. The siege, in its dark humor, highlighted the absurdity of humans fighting over a clump of rocks while simultaneously battling unseen microorganisms, a struggle as timeless as it is unglamorous. The castle, rebuilt, might once again stand tall, but the memory of the fall, the stench, the fear, the sheer grim absurdity of it all remained a lingering ghost in the cold stone walls. The siege finally lifted, not with a flourish of trumpets and a triumphant return to normalcy, but with a whimper. The conquering army, weary and depleted as much by disease as by battle, entered the castle not as victors, but as inheritors of a plague-ridden wasteland. The air hung heavy, not just with the scent of smoke and decay, but with the palpable miasma of sickness. The romanticized image of medieval life crumbled further, replaced by the grim reality of a populace ravaged by disease, a situation far more destructive than any battering ram or siege engine. The castle's sanitation, already questionable in times of peace, had collapsed entirely under the pressure of siege. Imagine the scene: overflowing chamber pots, festering refuse accumulating in the corners of the castle's cold, damp passages, and a pervasive stench so powerful it clung to the very stones. The castle's water supply, once a source of pride, was now a breeding ground for bacteria. Wells were contaminated, streams turned foul, and the limited supply that remained was a source of constant conflict and disease. The nobles' fine linens couldn't mask the stench of disease that permeated the air, a grim counterpoint to the tales of chivalrous knights and courtly love. The plague, a particularly nasty strain of bubonic, swept through the castle like a wildfire. It didn't discriminate. Knights and commoners, lords and ladies, all fell victim to its relentless advance. The once orderly routine of castle life was replaced by a chaotic scramble for survival. The clash of steel was replaced by the rattling cough of the dying, the thunder of siege engines by the mournful toll of the castle bell. The symptoms were as gruesome as they were terrifying. Feverish delirium, swollen lymph nodes, agonizing pain. The descriptions from surviving accounts paint a horrifying picture. The reality, unlike the romanticized tales of heroic sacrifice, was far messier. A brutal dance between life and death played out in dimly lit chambers and overflowing latrines. Medieval medicine, if you could call it that, was largely ineffective against this microscopic enemy. Leeching, bloodletting, and the application of various dubious herbal concoctions were as likely to hasten death as to alleviate suffering. Think of it as a particularly brutal game of Russian roulette, but with significantly worse odds. The castle's medical facilities, if you could even call them that, were quickly overwhelmed. The few physicians, often more versed in astrology than medicine, struggled to cope with the sheer scale of the crisis. Hospitals were non existent, of course, so makeshift medical spaces were arranged within the castle's overcrowded quarters, a sad testament to their utter lack of preparedness. Imagine rows of sick huddled together, their moans blending with the cries of the afflicted. The sounds of suffering filled the once grand halls, each cough, groan, and sigh an ominous reminder of mortality. This wasn't unique to this particular castle. Similar scenarios unfolded time and again throughout the Middle Ages. Castles, symbols of power and protection, became death traps when besieged, turning into breeding grounds for disease and despair. Consider the siege of Caerphilly Castle in Wales, for instance, where the cramped living conditions and lack of sanitation contributed to widespread outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid, decimating the population even before the opposing army breached the walls. Numerous accounts exist from castles throughout Europe, narrating similar tragedies. The chronicles are filled with tales of starvation, disease, and death, painting a far grimmer picture than the romanticized medieval feasts often portrayed in popular media. These documents are like morbidly amusing case studies, exposing the fallacy of the indestructible fortress narrative. Disease, it seems, was a far more potent weapon than any siege weapon. The psychological impact of the siege and its resultant plague was devastating. Fear and desperation hung heavy in the air, as heavy as the stench of decay. The noble lords and ladies, once accustomed to luxury and power, were reduced to cowering figures, helpless against a microscopic enemy. Their gilded cages offered no protection from the plague's insidious touch. Their carefully constructed image of invulnerability shattered. Even the knights, the supposed paragons of strength and courage, were not immune to fear. The armor, once a symbol of invincibility, became a symbol of their helplessness. Their skills in swordsmanship and siege warfare were useless against an enemy invisible to the naked eye. The sheer absurdity of their situation, masters of combat, brought low by bacteria, was tragically comic. The castle's fall wasn't a glorious battle. It was a slow, agonizing decline, a gruesome descent into chaos and despair. The once proud walls, once symbols of power and strength, became silent witnesses to widespread suffering and death. The noble halls, once filled with laughter and revelry, echoed with the groans of the dying. The story of the castle, stripped of its romantic embellishments, reveals the grim realities of medieval life, a reality where disease and decay were constant companions, far more formidable enemies than any army. The final days were marked by a grim resignation. The survivors, haunted by the specter of death and the memories of their lost loved ones, carried on with a mix of stoicism and despair. The rebuilding began, not with triumph, but with a weary acknowledgement of the fragility of life, a stark reminder that even the strongest stone cannot stand against the invisible forces of disease. The castle would rise again, its stones once more glistening under the sun, but the whispers of the plague would linger, a chilling echo in the renovated halls, a reminder of the devastating power of disease and the utter absurdity of the medieval world. And the humor, if there was any, was undeniably dark, like the black humor you find at a wake, bleak, yet somehow darkly hilarious, in the face of the sheer, unavoidable absurdity of it all. The wind whistled through the shattered windows of the castle, a mournful song echoing the emptiness within. Years after the plague subsided, the castle stood as a testament not to glorious battles, but to the relentless march of decay and the surprisingly fragile nature of medieval life. The romanticized image, the brave knights, the glittering court, the impregnable fortress, was nothing but a gilded lie, exposed by the stark reality of crumbling walls and the lingering stench of death. The ruins spoke volumes. Overgrown weeds pushed through cracked stone floors, their tenacious green a stark contrast to the gray, lifeless stone. The once grand halls, now open to the elements, were littered with debris, fragments of pottery, rusted remnants of weaponry, and the occasional unsettling discovery of a long-forgotten bone, a silent witness to the horrors within. The tapestries that once adorned the walls were reduced to tattered rags, their vibrant colors faded to dust, their intricate designs lost to time and decay. It wasn't just the physical decay that struck you, it was the eerie silence, the sounds of bustling court life, the clang of armor, the merrymaking, all vanished, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the occasional cry of a bird. The silence itself felt heavy, a tangible manifestation of the lives lost, the dreams shattered, the hopes extinguished within those very walls. One could almost feel the ghosts of the past, their breaths chilling the very air. One could imagine the terrified whispers of the dying, their anguished cries a mournful chorus echoing through the empty halls. The knights, once so proud and invincible, their armor gleaming under the sun, were now reduced to skeletons in the closet, or rather, skeletons in the decaying castle chambers, their once imposing strength laid bare, their power humbled by a microscopic enemy far deadlier than any human foe. The contrast between the idealized image and the grim reality was jarring. The popular historical portrayals, so often obsessed with chivalry and courtly romance, missed the mark entirely. They failed to capture the daily struggle for survival, the brutal realities of disease and starvation, and the sheer absurdity of a world where even the wealthiest and most powerful were vulnerable to the whims of fate. The decay wasn't just physical, it was also societal. The plague had not only ravaged the population, but also shattered the delicate balance of power within the castle and beyond. feudal hierarchies, once so rigidly defined, were thrown into disarray. The survivors, traumatized and depleted, struggled to rebuild not just their homes, but their entire social structures. The legacy of the castle wasn't just its crumbling stones, but the long-lasting impact on the survivors and their descendants, a legacy of loss, fear, and uncertainty. During the painstaking process of clearing the rubble, a team of archaeologists stumbled upon a hidden room, a secret chamber concealed behind a false wall in the castle's dungeon. The discovery was breathtaking. The room was surprisingly well preserved, miraculously escaping the ravages of time and the destruction of the plague. Inside, they found a collection of personal belongings, meticulously preserved. A woman's ornate hairbrush made of bone and silver, a child's wooden toy soldier, a leather-bound journal filled with faded ink, and several richly embroidered tapestries. The artifacts were stunning. They offered a glimpse into the lives of the castle's inhabitants, lives far more complex and nuanced than the historical narratives allowed. The journal, though difficult to decipher, revealed snippets of life before the plague. It detailed the daily routine, the anxieties, and the hopes of a young noblewoman who lived in the castle. The entries chronicled the mundane, from the daily struggle to keep warm during the harsh winters to her clandestine romances, her anxieties about the future, and her quiet observations of the court's politics. The contrast between the grim reality of the castle's decay and the intimate glimpses into the lives of its inhabitants was powerful and almost emotionally jarring. The artifacts weren't just relics of the past, they were windows into the hearts and minds of those who had once lived and breathed within these very walls. They humanized the medieval inhabitants, stripping away the layer of romanticized mythology to reveal the raw, vulnerable individuals who lived, loved, and died within the seemingly impenetrable fortress. The hairbrush, so elegantly crafted, spoke volumes of the woman's status and her dedication to appearances, even amidst the harsh realities of castle life. The child's toy soldier hinted at a life of privilege, yet also highlighted the fragility of childhood in a time of plague and war. The intricately embroidered tapestries, despite their damaged state, retained fragments of exquisite beauty, a reminder of the artistry and craftsmanship that thrived within the castle's walls before the disaster. The artifacts in the hidden room served as a powerful counterpoint to the prevailing narratives about the medieval period. They offered a more human, less heroic story, a story that embraced the mundane, the tragic, and the unexpected. It was a story that celebrated the resilience of the human spirit, its ability to find joy and beauty even in the face of unimaginable suffering. The discovery underscored the importance of meticulous historical research, a need to move beyond simplistic narratives and embrace the complexities of the past. The castle's ruins were not just a collection of stones, but a repository of untold stories, waiting to be discovered and shared. The story of the castle's fall and the discovery of the hidden room served as a powerful reminder that history is not just about kings and queens, knights, and battles. It is about the ordinary people, their everyday lives, their hopes and dreams, and their struggles to survive in a world far more challenging than the popular historical narratives suggest. The castle, in its ruin, offered a unique and poignant perspective on medieval life, a testament to both the resilience and vulnerability of human nature in the face of adversity. The legacy of the castle was not merely its physical remains, but the echoes of its history, the whispers of those who lived and died within its walls. The silence within the ruins was punctuated by the stories that emerged from beneath the rubble, transforming the scene from a desolate landscape into a poignant testament to the human experience, a darkly humorous yet ultimately heartbreaking journey through time. The castle's fall wasn't just a chapter in history, it was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the enduring absurdity of even the most imposing of fortresses in the face of something as seemingly insignificant as a bacterium. The ruins whispered tales of laughter and love, of despair and death, a tragic comedy played out under the unforgiving gaze of time. The castle, in its decline, stood as a haunting monument to the past, a reminder of the often forgotten realities of medieval life, a reality both tragically comical and deeply human. The dark humor inherent in the story wasn't simply a literary device, it was a reflection of the resilience of the human spirit, its ability to find humor even in the darkest of times. The castle's ruins, therefore, served not just as a graveyard for forgotten lives, but as a repository of laughter and tears, a morbid yet oddly engaging testament to the human condition. The laughter, however, remained firmly on the dark side, a reflection of the grim realities faced by those who inhabited the castle during its final days. The final chapter of the castle's story wasn't an ending, but a transformation, a shift from romantic myth to a more accurate, if less glamorous, account of the past, revealing the unexpectedly human side of medieval life. And yes, it's still darkly hilarious. The crumbling stones of the castle, once a symbol of power and might, now draw a different kind of visitor, the tourist, armed not with swords and shields, but with cameras and selfie sticks. They flock to these ruins, their minds filled with visions of valiant knights and damsels in distress, courtesy of countless Hollywood epics and romanticized historical novels. They expect a fairy tale. What they find, however, is something far less glamorous, and perhaps far more interesting. The disconnect between expectation and reality is often comically stark. Consider, for instance, the medieval toilets. Imagine the tour guide, a man named Barry, whose enthusiasm is inversely proportional to his historical accuracy, gesturing towards a gaping hole in the floor. And here, ladies and gentlemen, he'd announce with a theatrical flourish, is where the noble lords and ladies relieved themselves. Quite the communal experience, wouldn't you say? His audience, picturing the graceful figures of their favorite period dramas, might politely stifle a chuckle, oblivious to the actual aroma that must have permeated this very spot. A fragrance not easily captured in a cinematic masterpiece. The same goes for the castle's heating systems, or rather, the lack thereof. Barry might enthusiastically describe how the castle's inhabitants braved the elements, neglecting to mention the constant damp chill, the icy drafts that would have sent even the most hardened knight scurrying for extra layers of wool. His account, while charmingly delivered, skillfully omits the reality of a medieval winter, a constant struggle against hypothermia, a daily battle waged with thick furs and strategically placed braziers. These are not the heroic tales often spun, but they represent a far more accurate picture of daily life. The romanticized visions of medieval warmth and candlelight and cozy fireplaces bear little resemblance to the reality of shivering nobles huddled around meager fires, their breath misting in the freezing air. The supposed impenetrability of these fortresses is another prime candidate for a dose of dark humor. Barry, ever the optimistic guide, might point towards a crumbling wall, explaining how this stone behemoth withstood sieges and attacks for centuries. But a closer inspection might reveal the far less romantic truth. The walls were far from impenetrable. Many castles fell not to heroic assaults, but to disease, internal conflicts, or simple neglect. The impregnable fortress was often vulnerable to far more insidious enemies than invading armies. A particularly virulent strain of dysentery, for example, could prove far more effective than any siege weapon. The modern tourism industry, with its penchant for curated experiences and sanitized narratives, often fails to capture the full spectrum of castle life. The carefully crafted brochures and glossy websites portray a world of elegance and chivalry, carefully edited to exclude the grim realities of disease, poverty, and appalling hygiene. The unsavory details, the rampant vermin, the ever-present stench of human waste, the constant threat of disease are conveniently omitted. It is this dissonance between the idealized images promoted by tourism and the harsh realities revealed by historical research that forms the core of the humor. The contrast between the romanticized notions of knights and their glittering armor and the actual discomfort and impracticality of that armor is strikingly funny. Imagine a knight weighed down by 60 pounds of metal attempting to traverse a muddy field or climb a flight of stairs. The sheer absurdity of the situation is enough to induce laughter, even as one acknowledges the danger and hardship it represented. Consider the food, for example. Tourism might present a vision of lavish feasts, overflowing with succulent meats and exotic spices. However, the historical reality was far less appetizing. The diet of even the wealthiest individuals was often monotonous and repetitive, consisting largely of grains, vegetables, and occasionally a meager amount of meat. The idea of a perfectly cooked roast served on an elegantly set table was more of a fantasy than a reality for most castle inhabitants. The sheer unappetizing nature of much of the food consumed, its lack of variety, and its contribution to malnutrition and disease, again offers a darkly humorous counterpoint to the popular image of medieval cuisine. The medical practices of the time are another source of dark amusement. Imagine Barry, in a misguided attempt to convey an understanding of medieval medicine, explaining the healing properties of leeches and bloodletting. The audience might squirm in discomfort as Barry cheerfully illustrates the procedure, completely avoiding the gruesome details and the often fatal consequences of such treatments. The sheer primitiveness and inefficiency of medical care within the castles add yet another layer to the dark humor. The irony of highly developed military strategy and warfare coexisting with such rudimentary health practices provides an ironic juxtaposition. The tourist experience often sanitizes and romanticizes the past, overlooking the realities of human waste, rampant disease, and inadequate health care. A more complete understanding of the past involves acknowledging these realities, and here lies a unique opportunity for dark humor. The irony of modern tourists snapping selfies in front of sites that were once rife with disease and unpleasant conditions, their phones emitting a digital glow in a place where candles were a luxury, provides another layer of amusing contrast. The sheer inconvenience of medieval life offers further comedic potential. The absence of central heating, indoor plumbing, and even simple furniture could be mined for dark humor. Imagine trying to sleep in a drafty castle room with nothing but a thin straw mattress between you and the freezing floor, or sitting on a hard wooden bench for hours, your backside growing increasingly numb. These everyday hardships, when contrasted with the modern comforts and conveniences we take for granted, create a funny and thought-provoking juxtaposition. Ultimately, a responsible and humorous exploration of medieval castles requires a willingness to confront the unglamorous truth. By embracing the dark humor inherent in the contrast between romantic fantasy and gritty reality, we can foster a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the past. We can appreciate the achievements and resilience of those who lived in medieval castles, while simultaneously acknowledging the often comical absurdities of their daily lives. The castles themselves become not just monuments to history, but a stage for a darkly humorous and often poignant reflection on the human experience across centuries. It's a story that's both tragically funny and strangely compelling. And that, perhaps, is the most interesting aspect of all. The juxtaposition of the romantic and the reality is what makes the castle's stories so enduringly fascinating and darkly amusing. So, there we have it. We've journeyed through the surprisingly unglamorous lives of medieval castle dwellers, from the kings and queens down to the lowly stable hands. We've witnessed the sheer impracticality of medieval armor. Seriously, try putting on 60 pounds of metal in a hurry. The culinary delights, or lack thereof, of a diet heavily reliant on gruel, and the surprisingly sophisticated, for its time, military engineering that still couldn't completely outsmart a particularly virulent strain of the flu. But before we bid farewell to our chilly, drafty, and occasionally smelly friends, let's pause for a moment to consider the larger lessons etched into the very stones of these crumbling monuments. What can the fall and subsequent rise in a tourist-fueled afterlife of the medieval castle teach us about ourselves, our understanding of history, and our relentless pursuit of comfortable living? The most glaring lesson, perhaps, is the crucial role of sanitation, or rather, the devastating consequences of its absence. We laugh about the communal latrines, the ubiquitous stench, and the rampant vermin, but these weren't just minor inconveniences. They were death sentences, slowly delivered in the form of dysentery, typhoid, and a host of other diseases. The casual disregard for hygiene in medieval castles was a recipe for disaster, a stark reminder that even the mightiest fortress couldn't withstand the invisible enemy of disease. In a way, the castle's very stones whisper a chilling tale of public health neglect. It's a lesson that should resonate with us still, in an age where we battle antibiotic resistance and grapple with new, globally spreading diseases. Think about it. The castle's elaborate defenses against invading armies were nothing compared to their vulnerability to something as small and unseen as a virus. The strategic genius that planned moats and siege defenses was somehow blind to the far greater threat brewing within their own walls. Modern medicine, with all its advancements, still struggles to conquer disease. The medieval experience serves as a humbling reminder of our ongoing fight against microscopic foes. The lesson is clear. Sanitation is not a luxury, but a fundamental pillar of civilization. The castles remind us that investing in preventative measures is far cheaper and more effective than dealing with the catastrophic fallout of neglect. And speaking of expensive lessons, let's talk about the cost of maintaining a medieval castle. These weren't just homes, they were massive, resource intensive projects that demanded constant upkeep, repairing those crumbling walls, replacing broken siege engines, providing food and shelter for a whole host of inhabitants. It all added up to a substantial financial burden. The economic realities of sustaining a medieval castle offer a fascinating contrast to the romantic notion of effortless grandeur. It wasn't simply a matter of noble birth and military prowess. It demanded shrewd economic management, careful resource allocation, and a constant struggle to maintain the structure. This struggle is reflected in many of the castle's histories, marked by periods of both opulent splendor and desperate decay. Their fate was often sealed not by enemy attack, but by an inability to sustain the relentless demands of upkeep. Beyond the economics and the hygiene, however, the medieval castle offers us a profound insight into the shared human experience, irrespective of social standing. We tend to focus on the kings and queens, the knights and ladies, forgetting the countless individuals who labored anonymously behind the imposing stone walls. Cooks, stable hands, blacksmiths, servants. These individuals formed the backbone of castle life, and their contributions were essential to its functioning. Yet, their stories are frequently overlooked in favor of more glamorous narratives. The castle reminds us that history isn't just about the powerful, it's about the ordinary people who built, maintained, and inhabited these grand structures. It's about the shared challenges of survival, regardless of social class. The cold, the hunger, the diseases, these were realities for everyone within the castle walls, from the king to the scullery maid. In understanding their lives, however mundane or unpleasant, we find a profound connection to the past. The castle's narrative isn't just one of kings and queens. It's a tapestry woven from the experiences of thousands of individuals, a vibrant mosaic of stories, both grand and humble. One can't discuss medieval castles without touching upon the evolution of warfare, siege technology, and defensive strategies. The very existence of these grand structures stemmed from the need for defense. They represent a constant arms race, a relentless cycle of innovation and counter-innovation, mirroring our modern world's ongoing struggle to achieve security. The castles themselves evolved, growing more complex and sophisticated over time to meet increasingly advanced siege techniques. It was a dark, brutal period that saw many horrific battles and inhumane strategies employed. But the study of these strategies, of the ways in which people attempted to defend themselves against aggressors, is a vital aspect of our understanding of human conflict. The castles, in their physical form, are testaments to the evolution of warfare. The advancements in siege weaponry, in turn, led to changes in castle design. They weren't static, they changed and adapted constantly, a testament to human ingenuity and our persistent need for security and protection. And then there's the intriguing question of legacy. What do these crumbling stones tell us about the fleeting nature of power and the enduring strength of human resilience? Many of these castles, once symbols of unassailable power, are now just ruins, reclaimed by nature. Kings and queens, knights and ladies, are but names on faded parchments. Yet, the stones remain, silent witnesses to centuries of triumphs and tragedies, a testament to human endurance in the face of adversity. The castles stand as a monument, not only to power, but also to the inevitable passage of time and the impermanence of all things. Their continued existence, in a new form as tourist attractions, speaks volumes about the human desire to connect with our past, to learn from its mistakes, and to find amusement in the contrast between our romanticized perceptions and the realities of the past. The very act of people visiting these ruins, snapping photos, and contemplating the lives of those who came before, offers a fascinating commentary on our relationship with history and the ways in which we continue to reinterpret and repurpose the past. The stones of medieval castles have much to teach us. They are not simply objects of historical interest. They are vessels of wisdom, whispering stories of past lives and offering valuable lessons for the present. From the importance of sanitation to the enduring strength of human resilience, the castle's legacy extends beyond their imposing walls, prompting reflection and offering both a historical lesson and a darkly humorous perspective on the human condition throughout the ages. The castle's enduring appeal lies precisely in this fascinating contrast between the romantic ideals and the often absurd realities of medieval life, and that, perhaps, is the most compelling lesson of all.